Welcome, everyone. My name is Matt Christensen. I'm FERC's General Counsel. This is the time and place that has been noticed for the second meeting of the Joint Federal-State Task Force on Electric Transmission to consider the matters that have been posted in the agenda issued on February 2nd, 2021, in docket AD 2115. The meeting is on the record, and a transcript will be placed in the docket. The public can listen and observe in the room as well as online. Any comments by the public can be submitted into the docket through FERC's e-filing system. Please visit the FERC website. Today's discussion should avoid the merits of pending contested matters before FERC, and I will interrupt discussions, apologies in advance, if we come close to the line. In that regard, we have issued a notice observing that certain proceedings pending before the Commission may be implicated by today's discussion. Nevertheless, we ask that task force members address those issues only generally or generically and not speak to the specifics of any of those pending proceedings. With that, I hope that concludes my speaking role, and I'll turn this over to Chairman Glick.
Thank you very much, Matt. And before we get started, I want to very much thank the team at NARUC and also at FERC, led by Liz Salerno, for putting this together. It's a lot of work. It takes a lot of time and effort, and really appreciate the time and effort that they put into it. And I want to start, first of all, by welcoming our newest members to the task force. My colleague at FERC, Commissioner Phillips. Everyone knows him, obviously, from his days as a state regulator, but also Chair LeVar from the Utah Commission. And welcome to both of you, and thank you very much, and look forward to working with you on this very interesting task force. And I also wanted to take a quick second to thank Commissioner Raper, Christine Raper, who left the Idaho Commission recently, for her participation on this panel, but also for her leadership on a number of very important Western issues. So I think everyone knows that we had a very good, dialogue discussion at the NARUC meeting in Louisville last November. And this is the second of our meetings, and we decided to go with a very non-controversial and easy subject today, which is transmission cost allocation. I used to work for a senator from Arkansas, and he was fond of saying that everyone wants to go to heaven, but no one wants to die. And to me, that's very similar to transmission cost allocation. Everyone wants more transmission, but no one wants to pay for it. And that's the kind of the situation we're in today. And I think, at the outset, it's important, and we're going to hear this a lot today. I'm going to talk about it, others will as well. But the courts, from a FERC perspective, the courts have required FERC to allocate transmission costs in a manner roughly commensurate with benefits. And that's the law. That's what we're required to do. And everything we deal with regard to transmission cost allocation is looking through that prism. But I think what we need to do is take a look at how the regions are handling cost allocations. Are they fully assessing all the benefits that are associated with new transmission facilities and allocating the cost accordingly? Are they doing it more narrowly? And obviously, if they're not doing it properly from a regional perspective, at least from my perspective, FERC needs to take a look at that and maybe make some changes as we go along. I've said this before, and I mean it. I know everyone probably agrees that on the subject of transmission cost allocation, we're not an island. FERC has significant authority over the allocation of transmission costs, but it would be foolish to think that we could just do whatever we need to do and go home. The fact remains that the states have an enormous role to play in transmission, and that includes issues related to cost allocation, because if a particular state or a group of states don't like how transmission costs are allocated, it's going to be much more difficult to cite that particular project. And so I think we very much need to work together. And I know we will. I've talked to Chair Stanek about it and others. And that's, it's to me, it's vital that we go into this arm in arm and try to figure out an approach that we all can live with. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chair Stanek, but I really look forward to the discussion today. And hopefully everyone will be able to participate. And I also want to take a quick second to welcome and thank Chair French. Obviously, we had a little scare yesterday, but he's looks healthy, doing well, and really glad that you're able to join us today. I'll turn it over to Chair Stanek now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chair French is our secret weapon, so we definitely needed him back in the rotation for today. I'd like to also welcome Commissioner Phillips and Chair LeVar to the table. This body has had a tremendous impact so far in our discussions. Since we last met in Louisville about 3 months ago, the state membership has continued to have discussions on how do we improve the current processes to better inform cost allocation in a very efficient manner. At the last task force meeting, we had broad general consensus that reform in future transmission planning is necessary, not only to have state input provided early, but to ensure that we continue to have some level of regional flexibility. So as Chair Glick just mentioned, the focus of today's conference is who is going to pay for all this new transmission capacity and infrastructure. And it's largely, we recognize, going to accommodate a growing wave of clean energy resources. So it's that uncomfortable, complicated question, not unlike one when you go out to a dinner party with a large group of friends and the check comes and it's itemized for some portions and not for others. I did not order the appetizer, but I tasted one or two, so should I be required to pay for that? Do we use a postage stamp rate, just split the bill equally? Or do we use a methodology where you ordered it, you pay for it? There's obviously many different ways to address these thorny issues, and we're going to hopefully figure that out today. I think the answers will be more important to some regions, to some states, to some utilities than others, especially if you're the party who ordered the side salad and water and everybody else at the table ordered the Flamin' Young. If that question isn't hard enough, the question of who pays, we also have to look at the question of who benefits from these infrastructure projects. And any good economist will tell you that it's much more difficult to quantify benefits than to quantify costs. But hopefully we'll explore some of these issues today if our goal is to fairly assign costs to beneficiaries, which NARUC supports as a key principle in the Order 1000 cost allocation principles. One item advertised on the agenda also is how do we best measure some of these benefits? We recognize some of them are very easy to quantify, such as adjusted production costs, and some of them are much harder to quantify. We know they exist. They are known unknowns, but it's hard to put a price tag on them in terms of societal benefits, economic development, clean air. So hopefully we'll figure out how to discuss those, how to assign those costs, how to determine net beneficiaries. Of course, for the states, and I'm sure for our federal colleagues, costs are at the forefront of our minds. And one question that I'd like to leave us with as we begin the program is, are we seeking the lowest cost transmission projects, or are we seeking the lowest delivered cost of energy? Because those two answers are going to be very different as we figure out cost allocation. So I look forward to the conversations and discussion today. And at this point, I will turn for brief introductions. Chair Glick.
So, and I did forget one thing, and a very important thing. So, and thank you very much, Chair Stanek. So we, in Louisville, I think we had a very good discussion, as I mentioned earlier. But we thought when we were talking about how we could enhance and improve upon the meeting that we had in Louisville, we thought it was very important to add a moderator. And thankfully, Dr. Jonathan Robb has agreed to join us. And I think everyone is probably familiar with Dr. Robb, either from his participation in the PJM roundtables or the New England roundtables. He's had a string of opportunities related to working with different stakeholders in terms of consensus building on energy, environmental, and regulatory issues across many regions and states. And we look forward to having him here and helping us. And I want to introduce Dr. Robb, and he can lay the groundwork for what we're going to do today.
And Chair Glick, if we could just provide an opportunity for Commissioner Phillips and Chair LeVar also to provide a brief opening statement. Chair Phillips.
Thank you, Chair Stanek. Thank you, Chairman Glick. We'll be brief. I can tell you this is among the first opportunities I've had to speak as a FERC commissioner, and I cannot think of a more appropriate place. Because this is my first time and I don't want to mess up, I'm going to read what I'm going to say, and it will be brief. As I said, I'm glad to be here and I'm very excited for this opportunity. I believe that greater state-federal cooperation is critical if we are to solve the transmission challenges we face. My views on today's topics are informed by my past experiences at NERC and as a state regulator. I seek solutions that balance reliability, affordability, and sustainability. And we need policies that incentivize transmission investments to accommodate new generation and ensure reliability, while also containing costs and allocating them appropriately. The list of challenges we face is long, as folks have talked about. During this energy transition, new transmission must be built in response to extreme weather, more sustainable and variable resources, greater electrification and demand, state and federal clean energy policies, and changing consumer preferences. We must also consider when and how we can make our grid more reliable and efficient through the use of grid-enhancing technologies. I believe we need to work toward ensuring a resilient grid for the future by anticipating long-term transmission needs, but also controlling the costs which ultimately get passed on to consumers through their bills. Having grown up in rural Alabama, I know firsthand how any cost increase can affect customers, and that affordability is a critical backbone to economic development. Given the current transition and transmission planning, this is a great opportunity. I'm looking forward to the discussion today. I look forward to partnering with my state colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Phillips. And from the Beehive State, our newest addition, Chair LeVar from the Utah Public Service Commission.
Thank you. I'm really impressed that you knew that slogan. We're working on a new state flag that might actually have that in a little less complicated way. Chair Stanek and Chair Glick, thank you for the chance to be here. I want to join both of you in thanking former Idaho Commissioner Christine Raper. I think I'm too close to this, for all the work she did on this task force and on regional issues generally. Those are tough shoes to fill for this task force. But I was honored with the chance to participate because I have a lot of respect for the diverse views and perspectives from the Western states. People sometimes like to try to lump Western state perspectives into groups like the coastal states, the Intermountain states, the Southwest, but I don't believe that's a very accurate characterization of the interests. I think there's a lot more diversity across the Western states than those generalizations recognize. But one thing we have in common in the Western interconnection is stakeholders know how to defend their state policy objectives, and they know how to respect the policy objectives of other states. And some of the evidence of that is in some of the momentum we've had recently in energy markets and resource planning. There's been efforts by both the California ISO and the Southwest Power Pool and the newly renamed Western Power Pool on those areas. Now, those areas are not yet touching transmission planning, but the momentum that they're building on energy markets and on resource planning is a necessary first step towards what I think everyone agrees is the most important development that can happen in the West on transmission planning is more regional coordination. I think everyone agrees that kind of coordination on transmission would make more difference than anything else in the West. So these other efforts have to be successful, and the respect that states are showing for each other's different policies, I think is meaningful in the West and is creating momentum along that front. And so to that end, I think one of the most important things that the Western United States needs is time and space to continue this momentum, to continue the work on the energy markets and the resource adequacy so that we can have the trust and build the foundation to move towards transmission coordination. Time and space requires proper government role. To me, both state and federal government can enable increased trust and increased development of regional coordination. But when state or federal government tries to direct or dictate where that goes, then that leads to potential polarization and potential difficulties. So with that, I appreciate the transparent way that all the members of FERC have been approaching this issue and the transparent dialogue that FERC has been having with stakeholders, and not just this task force, but in lots of other forums. FERC has a long-standing tradition of independence that avoids the kind of policymaking that flip-flops every time the administration changes political parties. And to me, that kind of durable policymaking is important in this area because transmission stakeholders deserve durable solutions, and I trust that the upcoming NOPRs will reflect that. There are a lot of challenges in the Western United States, but there's a lot of wonderful things happening. I come from a state that, like many other Western states, customers enjoy safe, reliable, and affordable electric power system, and we have for decades. Anything that impacts transmission development needs to respect and improve those metrics. If we're not making things more safe, affordable, and reliable, then we shouldn't be doing what we're doing. And then finally, I just want to make one comment that might seem a non sequitur, but I think some of the drivers that are pushing the need for transmission infrastructure are also increasing the interdependence between electric transmission infrastructure and natural gas pipeline infrastructure. Primarily, the growth of renewable energy and retirement of coal generation is going to make the interdependence and the interreliability of those two systems more and more important as we go forward. So I recognize the second one's not a topic of this task force, but it's also important to me to say that they can't be separated. They're going to become more and more connected as we go forward. And I'm excited to be part of this group. Thank you.
So with that, off we go. I wanted to just start by thanking FERC and NARUC for inviting me a couple of weeks ago to help them fine-tune the agenda and then to moderate this very historic and important session that we'll have today. We have the agenda divided into two parts, and we have a lot of sub-questions and subtopics as well. We'll be taking a break, a 45-minute break, just so that the audience knows, from 11:45 to 12:30. Because we do have a lot of subtopics that we want to cover, we're going to be moving at a pretty rapid clip. We're going to want to hear, obviously, perspectives, but we also really want to have some time for back and forth dialogue as much as possible. So we'll just encourage everybody to be as concise as possible so we can get everybody to weigh in. And in preparation for the meeting, I reviewed the recording for the first collegial and productive meeting that the task force had, and then spoke both with the staff and the co-chairs a little bit about how we might just tweak things a little bit process-wise so that we can start to build the transition from this feeling a little bit more like a technical session into really a interactive task force where you're all sort of jointly challenged to problem solve in this complicated area. So for some questions, we'll be alternating kind of opening comments from 1 to 3 state commissioners or chairs, and for other questions, we'll be starting with FERC. And we just want to remind everyone this is really a bi-directional interactive conversation among the task force members. We encourage you to continue asking questions of each other. There was a lot of that in the first meeting, and that I think was very effective. But we also want to encourage you to make sure that you're also sharing your own perspectives and experiences as we move forward. So for the states, obviously your first charge has been to represent your region. But you also come with a lot of experience from within your state and also personal experience. So we just ask you, when you're kind of putting on your own state's hat, which we don't want to preclude you from doing, you should just be clear that's what you're doing. And we'll continue to use the tent card system that you used before. So if you put up your tent card, this is our California Commissioner's tent card. When you want to speak, we'll keep a queue, but also just encourage you, if you feel like you need to make an immediate response to something that was said or a question that you don't want to wait for the whole queue, you can just kind of wave it a little bit at me, and I'll know that you just want to kind of interject briefly to either correct something or before we get too far down the road. And that's about it. Anybody have any questions before we put on our seatbelts and take off here? Okay, and just remind everybody to speak into the mic so everybody can hear, and that's good. So the first topic is is the discussion of the specific categories and types of transmission benefits that transmission providers should consider for the purposes of transmission planning and cost allocation. And we're going to start by focusing on the categories of transmission. There are 3 specific categories, types of transmission facilities that have been considered to date for the purposes of transmission planning and cost allocation are currently reliability, economics, public policy. So the first question is, can and should these 3 categories and types of transmission considered for the purposes of planning and cost allocation be expanded or changed? And if so, what specific categories or types of benefits should be considered for the purposes of allocating the cost of transmission to ratepayers, or what kind of changes would you recommend? And I actually have our California Commissioner Rechtschaffen is going to start off the conversation, which is why his card is raised. And also, when he wants to make comments during the meeting, he's going to text one of the FERC staff, and they're going to just, or NARUC staff, they're going to just come up, put the card up. So if you see that card going up, that's what's going on. So, Commissioner.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rab, and good morning or afternoon, everybody. Sorry I couldn't be there in person. The answer I have for this question is yes. The 3 traditional categories of transmission considered should be expanded to include a more comprehensive set of transmission-related benefits. NARUC, in our comments on the INOPR, argued that the Commission should issue policy guidance that identifies additional types of benefits and methods of assessing those that would be acceptable to the Commission. In the West, a number of states support a more expansive definition of benefits. I want to be clear, though, I'm not speaking for the whole region here. As Chair LeVar said, the West is very diverse. So more specifically, I think the Commission should issue guidance explaining the three traditional categories of benefits can and should be included, to include those that are not routinely considered now, and the reliability benefit, the reliability category should be expanded to include resilience, for example, grid hardening projects that protect against high impact and high likelihood events. The economic category can and should be expanded to include improved connectivity to lower cost generation resources, and that can reduce market power, can improve resource portfolio diversity. And the public policy category can and should be expanded to include transforming transmission portfolios to facilitate clean energy development and also broader environmental goals. One important point I really want to emphasize is that we have had significant experience over the past decade with multi-value transmission planning that do incorporate a broad range of benefits, such as those I'm talking about. We've seen this in a number of RTOs, ISOs, SPP, MISO, the California ISO, the New York ISO. And the Commission should leverage best practices from these efforts. I would also argue Commission guidance should extend the time frame over which benefits are considered to be longer, maybe 15, 20 years or longer. Among other things, this better corresponds to longer range goals such as renewables integration and emissions reductions targets. As a representative of the West, we have really been challenged greatly by extreme events lately, including those resulting from climate change, which have really tested the resiliency of the grid. So I'm particularly interested in consideration of resilience benefits. There are, of course, other impact high probability events, such as increasingly intense hurricanes on the east, like Superstorm Sandy and others that fall into this category. I think as a first step, the Commission should define resilience and then provide guidance about how region-specific resilience criteria should be developed and assessed. Resilience is inherently a regional concern, and that this echoes a lot of our NARUC themes, but it could certainly benefit from FERC guidance. I think FERC guidance could also identify potential environmental benefits of transmission infrastructure, such as emissions reductions. And then lastly, I'll note which may be clear to many, that while some benefits fall into one category squarely, many benefits or others can fall into more than one. Improved connectivity can, on the one hand, provide access to lower cost generation, and that's an economic benefit, but it can also mean additional pathways for connecting generation resources with load in regions that are constrained by weather events and unplanned outages. And that insurance value can be very, very important. That can provide reliability and resilience benefits as well. So in some, quantifying a broader range of benefits, doing it over an extended time period where appropriate, can yield hopefully a more comprehensive benefit cost analysis, and in the end lead to better planning, lead us to avoid rejecting investments that are beneficial and that could reduce overall system costs. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Allen.
Thank you, Dr. Webb. Let me bring this a little bit closer. So I'll take your point early on to heart and just point out that I actually agree with the comments of Commissioner Richthofen from California. We had a chance to colloquy before this event and exchange ideas, and I think we are pretty much in the same place on the category of benefits. So I'll try to avoid repeating myself there. I did want to start out by making a very high-level point about my comments here, but also later in the program when we talk about cost allocation, which is, I think you'll hear that there's a theme behind my comments. It's around the topic of cost containment. It's very closely related to the comments that Commissioner Phillips had brought out about affordability. There is, what we're talking about here as we consider these issues bears directly on cost, and the bill is potentially going to be large over time. It's important that we internalize our sense and ambitions around cost containment. But when I say cost containment, I don't mean lowest first cost. I mean lowest long-term cost. We're talking about potentially a multiple of existing transmission capacity over the coming decade and decades ahead. It's important that we think long-term about what it is we're doing with the transmission system. I wanted to add a little bit of dimension and color to the topic of benefits. As Mr. Richthofen had mentioned, we do have, and we now have, essentially a pretty robust body of experience behind us with multi-value frameworks for planning in New England. We're embarking on planning efforts in cooperation with ISO New England, who I want to express my appreciation to them for the good work that they are doing to help us to add these projects, Transmission 2050 and a one transmission concept that our UNESCO helped us to move forward with. With respect to the issue of time, I think when you look at what we're doing, we're making investments that have 40 to 60 years lived, that are 60 to 40-year lived assets, and it's important from my standpoint to recognize the benefits that follow in those time frames. I prefer at least a 20-year time frame going forward. I think you can address uncertainties through risk premiums on discount rates and probabilistic assessments of scenarios and the like. There are methods for properly accounting for the uncertainties and risks of benefits, but I believe it's short-sighted to not recognize the benefits over time. I believe that we should be looking at, and I'll stray a little bit into the planning dimension of this, but I believe that we should be looking at projects and benefits on a portfolio basis. There are synergies between projects. It's important that as we plan, we not build the wrong projects because we're looking at these projects in silos. We need to take a integrated look at a more integrated look at a project and the categories of projects that we're working with. I prefer to not dimension projects going forward by 3 silos. I do embrace the notion of including more categories of benefits, but often we find that even within those silos of categories, there are multiple benefit categories that need to be recognized. And I'll just because I have a background in economics, I'll just say that when I support the concepts of an integrated analysis and looking at portfolios, I don't mean to kludge projects that aren't beneficial or don't have a benefit, a positive benefit cost ratio with those that don't. Every project that is part of a portfolio should contribute to the positiveness of, or the benefits, the benefit ratios that are associated with a portfolio. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioners. So I think we're going to turn to provide an opportunity for one or more FERC commissioners to just share some of their views. I think so far we've heard a few different threads from both of the state commissioners, look at expanding additional benefits within each category, but at the same time also looking at multi-value planning, portfolio planning, think about a longer time frame. And then the question of how helpful the 3 silos still are as we move forward, recognizing that projects in each silo have benefits that can cut across the silos. So with that, let's just see if we can have at least 1 or 2 FERC commissioners to just offer some of your initial thoughts, and then we'll just open it up for back and forth. Yeah, Chairman Glick.
Thank you, Dr. Ebb. I agree with much of what has been said already. I would just to reiterate a couple things. First of all, in terms of the silo approach, it might have made some sense in the past, but I think it's making less sense as we go forward, in large part, as has already been mentioned a couple times, that their projects don't just provide benefits in one area. The projects may be identified for reliability needs. They may provide other benefits from economic needs or other benefits, including resilience. I think resilience is a good example. I think this idea that we can just plan for and then allocate the cost for transmission based on one particular set of benefits probably is a little bit outdated, and I think doesn't mix with reality. Secondly, and resilience was mentioned, I think that's whether you can include that in the reliability category or not, and I think we can certainly debate that. But there's no doubt that as we face continuing incidences of extreme weather, whether that be in the West, obviously with heat and wildfires or extreme cold or tornadoes or hurricanes, whatever it might be, that there is going to need to be, that the transmission grid is going to need to be built out or invested in more in order to address some of those resilience concerns. And then how do you identify beneficiaries there? Obviously, the way many regions handle cost allocation with regard to reliability doesn't seem to make sense from a resilience perspective. And then the concept has been laid out about multi-value projects and also portfolio approach. And obviously there are some regions that have had some great experience with that already, and it seems to make a lot of sense. I don't disagree, Commissioner Allen, that you have to make sure that each individual project meets some sort of cost-benefit test, and that would be done on a regional basis. But it strikes me that it makes more sense, and it probably leads to less acrimony in the long run if you take a whole group of projects that provide a number of different types of benefits and not fight on a case-by-case basis about who's going to have to pay for one particular project. Now, again, I think you're exactly right. Cost containment is a big issue. We're talking about billions and billions of dollars of expenditures. And when we allocate costs, we always need to make sure not only that the beneficiary pays, but the beneficiary is getting the bang for the buck. And that's something I think from a FERC perspective, we definitely needed to address. And I would gather that my colleagues agree with that as well. But again, I know that just as an example, I think, I know California uses somewhat of the siloed approach, but then they actually expand upon that. So for instance, if you're planning for reliability, but then it turns out that that particular project provides other benefits in terms of economics and so on, that's recognized in the cost allocation process. That's another method of getting at this. There's a lot of different ways of getting at this approach, but I think the old traditional siloed approach probably, as I said before, is a little bit outdated.
Do we have another FERC commissioner that wants to jump in just before we open it up? Yes, Commissioner Christie.
Thank you very much, and great to be back at NARUC, always is. All my former colleagues. On the train up here from Richmond today, I went back and reread the NARUC comment, and it improves on rereading, unlike a lot of books. But the NARUC comment actually does improve on rereading, and I want to mention a couple of things that are relevant to what we've just heard. First of all, one theme that comes through the NARUC comment is that benefits have to be specific and verifiable in order to justify cost allocation. Generalized benefits cannot be cost allocated. It wouldn't meet the Seventh Circuit decision, and it wouldn't just be right. So just note that when we talk about expanding benefits, that in NARUC's own comment, they've got to be specific and verifiable. Another thing NARUC mentioned is protection of consumers from broad estimates of transmission benefits that don't pan out. And NARUC specifically in their comment on page 29 talks about that planning transmission for a 10, 15, 20-year time frame, it says specifically, please protect consumers from the chance that the transmission projects don't pan out, but consumers have to pay for it. And a lot of the 15, 20, 25-year time frame planning we're hearing about really sounds to me, and NARUC mentions it in their comment, it sounds like an IRP process. And those of us who've done IRPs at the state level, I've done many, know that an IRP is basically a snapshot, and you don't build $1 billion project based on a 15-year snapshot. You have CPCN proceedings for that. So I would just caution that in looking at a 15-year holistic plan that sounds like an IRP, and states are set up to do IRPs, I don't know that the RTOs are set up to do IRPs. Now, another thing I would also note is we ought to go ahead and acknowledge Commissioner Rechtschaffen from California comes from a single state RTO. Whatever criteria they put in subject to state public policy are going to reflect the policies of California, and that's fine. They're only going to pay for them in California. A multi-state RTO is different, and I think we ought to recognize that up front. And when you get into cost allocation, I think it's going to be a different equation with the multi-state RTOs where you have the problem of cost shifting.
Thank you. So before we move on to another question, just any reactions to what you've heard so far? Obviously, there were many things, and we'll be both layering on and returning to these things as we go forward. But just before we go on, just chance for anybody to comment on anything that your colleagues have said so far. Let me just see if I can grab somebody, if anybody else wants to jump in before I return to you, Commissioner Allen. Commissioner Nelson?
Yeah, I just want to react a little bit to the RTOs being set up to do integrated resource planning. And, certainly I know that states do it quite frequently in certain areas. I know in ISO New England, we've allocated most of that to ISO New England as the main entity looking at concerns in the region. So I'm just wondering if maybe we could discuss a little bit more about the concerns on having a centralized RTO look at integrated resource planning if we are considering both looking at benefits and looking at costs being spread on a multi-state jurisdiction. Because I think Commissioner Christie brings up good points, but I think that's a problem that maybe is appropriate to give to an RTO. And maybe he could clarify a little bit whether he thinks that the RTOs aren't set up and shouldn't, or the RTOs aren't ready right now but could be. And I think maybe that's a distinction I was curious about.
I'm not sure, Commissioner Christie, whether you wanted, can we task our RTOs with integrated transmission planning, and aren't they doing some sort of that already?
Well, the question is if we want to have that discussion, let's do it. Do you want RTOs to be basically integrated planners? At the state level, a utility comes in with an IRP, and it is an integrated generation and transmission plan, as well as the other resources that the utility might want to build. And you approve it on a 10, 15-year, sometimes 20-year time frame. But you don't approve, at least in Virginia, and I think most states, the IRP itself is a snapshot, it's a planning document. It doesn't stand as approval of a specific project that may well cost $1 billion to be charged to consumers. And at the state level, when you have an IRP, the public has full access to it, and state regulators are used to doing them. State regulators can have public participation, public access, scrutiny, and the state regulators also are the same ones who are going to have to approve the projects that are in the IRP. So it's a snapshot, it's a planning document. It doesn't stand as approval of any single asset. The RTOs are set up to plan transmission, and when they put it in the regional plan, of course, they're essentially saying this project should be built. The decision, though, is going to come back to the state whether to build it or not. And so I don't think that's what RTOs were set up to do. RTOs were set up as transmission planners to plan regional projects, but still it comes back to the state to determine whether to actually build the project. So are RTOs set up to fulfill what states do when states approve IRPs? You're giving an RTO a much bigger role, and I don't know that they're set up to do it. I think it's a fine discussion to have. I think it really is. But to say RTOs ought to now be doing IRPs, and unlike IRPs, which are a snapshot, what you're saying, or what some people honestly want to see happen, is if it's in the IRP at the RTO level, then the money automatically starts to flow to the developer, because right now, as you know, when a project goes into the regional plan, it triggers cost allocation, and it also triggers QIP. So the money starts to flow even before the states have even had a chance to say yes or no on the project.
Commissioner Duffley.
Good morning. I represent the Seabrook region, and as you know, most of the states within the Seabrook region are not within an RTO construct. However, I guess with respect to this issue about IRP planning by an RTO, I think we need to look at the jurisdictional perspective. States have traditionally been responsible for resource adequacy, and I have heard through the rumor mill, I don't know if I've heard it directly, but some RTOs do not believe that they are responsible for resource adequacy. So we would need to speak to the RTOs to see if that is something that they would be willing to take on, or that they think they already have the responsibility for. But we should look at the jurisdictional questions surrounding that comment.
Great. So an important question, planning question, it's related to cost allocation. I want to just keep us moving and on schedule, so I'm going to just layer in the next question, and again, we'll just keep building. So the next question is, are the existing 3 categories of transmission, sort of returning back to this, being adequately considered, or can they be approved upon either separately or together? And if so, specifically how? And I think we were going to start here with whether any of the FERC commissioners wanted to jump in, and then we've got a couple of state commissioners. So any of the FERC commissioners, I think Chairman Glick commented a bit on this already. Others? Yes, Commissioner Clement.
Hi, good morning. Thank you, Dr. Robb. I'm really encouraged by the conversation so far and getting perspectives on how we think about the right way to both build out the system needs, as we know, from a reliability, from a resilience perspective, from a lowest cost delivery of electricity to customers perspective, while at the same time ensuring that we're thinking about protecting customers in the process. I think that's a critical point. When it comes to how we define the benefits, we have learned a lot in the last 12 years. We learned so much through the experience of Winter Storm Uri, for example, when you had a set of multi-value lines in the MISO region, in addition to other lines providing inter-regional connectivity that provided tremendous critical benefits. And we don't have a particular way of capturing those benefits, even though we see them playing out in real life. And so I think what we should be doing is keeping those principles in mind, keeping the need to protect customers, and certainly keeping the principle in mind that the Federal Power Act requires and the courts have been clear about, which is that people who don't benefit from projects shouldn't pay for them. But if we all embrace that as the starting point, I think there's a lot of opportunity to improve as long as we keep customers in mind while we're doing it. I think it's really important to accept the starting point that money is getting spent every year on transmission investment and continues to increase year over year. We have a choice when we sit down and have these conversations around how to most effectively define benefits and therefore determine who pays for that investment, to do so in a way that looks forward, that state, we're not, I don't want to get lost in the IRP conversation because that's not really on the table. What we're talking about is transmission planning and the opportunity to look forward, to think about the best way to protect customers over time.
Sorry, Chair Brown Dutrell, you had your card up, so.
My mic won't, oh, there you go, all right. Good morning and thank you. When you say layering on the conversation, I kept thinking about the first question and where we were going, and I do appreciate the reiteration of the NARUC comments that we had placed on the record in terms of the principles of Order 1000, and we thought that they should remain in place. I also do appreciate the conversation, and as I have said to some of my NARUC members, that as we continue to talk and discuss things, I think we get a clearer understanding. So I do appreciate even Commissioner Clements saying and reiterating that the principle, if you're not benefiting from the project, you shouldn't have to pay for it. Because I do believe in the course of the conversation that I've heard over many times, even outside of this meeting, is as we bring on different things in terms of the needs for upgrading the grid, it is expanding the idea of who pays for it, even if they don't necessarily benefit from it. So I would just start with that premise and just say, as I come from a region that's very diverse, the MACRC region is very diverse, and not all the states within MACRC fit into the PJM footprint, but most of them. And even within the PJM footprint of the RTO, it's just very diverse. So when I look at the three categories and do we need to expand them, and I've heard some of the conversation back and forth, I go back to my legal background and say, I think that the definition can be expanded and has been expanded because I've seen what other RTOs are doing. And I think that the flexibility has already been built in, that the RTOs can look to see what works best for them. So as I focus on PJM and the MACRC region, and I look at reliability and economics and public policy, and we see different states are doing different things with their public policy, I also see what's already available to us within our region. And with that, we have, I know we talk about MISO's multi-driver or multi-value projects that they use, and then PJM has the multi-driver option, which I think came into place probably like 7 or so years ago. But I'm not sure that it's actually used to the degree that it could be. Not to say that I have a solution to solving that, but I think it can be looked at in more detail to try to figure out why it's not being taken advantage of and what the benefits could be in terms of using that. So when I look at the question, I think that the three areas can still remain in place because there's the flexibility already built in that the areas decide what's worked best for them. But we can delve a little bit deeper whether or not it's being, I'll say in PJM, that the multi-driver is actually being used adequately. I think there's need for clarification and a deep dive on that.
Chair French.
Thank you. Well, this question's really pretty similar to the first question, and I'm going to touch on a lot of themes that folks have touched on before me. I think I'm similarly situated to Commissioner Brown-Dutrell in the sense that I think these three categories are extremely broad. That you can fit resiliency underneath reliability. You can fit environmental under public policy and potentially under economic. But there may be a place for FERC to make that more clear, to give some direction that, hey, folks, we know resilience is a needed benefit, and that can fit under reliability, and make sure your modeling reflects that in the future, and your cost-benefit tests reflect that in the future. It still needs to meet a cost-benefit test. We need to be able to evaluate it and measure whether that resiliency and hardening benefits customers. But maybe it would be helpful to have that. But I do want to caution against, we've all seen the lists of dozens of different benefits that transmission can provide. And I think that we should exercise a little bit of caution in just saying, we're going to plan using all of these benefits. We are going to build every single project we can, and we're going to justify it with these lists of dozens of different benefits. And while I believe transmission does provide those benefits, one of the nice things right now is that we don't necessarily build every single project we plan. Some of those benefits are held in reserve. They help customers know that they are getting a good deal, because if something meets a 1.0 cost benefit, likely the cost benefit is much higher than that. And so that provides a level of comfort to customers. And the more you eat into that, you could erode the public confidence, which I would warn a little against. So I don't have a big issue with the type of benefits we have now and the three categories. But what I do want to talk just a little bit about is how you consider those categories along with other benefits. And it's the idea, everybody's talking about it, removing the silos. It's not so much expanding the categories of benefits, but it is making sure that you consider all of the benefits together when you plan these projects. These can be, I think the three categories we talk about, those are the benefits to load. But what we're not even talking about are benefits to other entities. You've got the transmission developer community, which is going to benefit from certain build out. You've got transmission service customers that may benefit. And so, you have folks that may be directly assigned costs, and they could help cost share with load who's receiving these other benefits. And let me give one final point here. I want to give the example of an ongoing planning process between the Southwest Power Pool and MISO. They call it the Joint Targeted Interconnection Queue Study. This to me is a really big deal. I think it's on the cutting edge of exactly what we're talking about of taking down silos. There are a series of 7 projects of around $1.7 billion, I believe, and they are planned to create more capacity on the system to enable a lot of new generation to interconnect. But SPP and MISO are also quantifying the economic benefits associated with those projects, relieving congestion, allowing lower cost energy to flow to load. And so, of course, then we will be able to have a cost allocation discussion, which will be a lot of fun, but we should have a lot of data at that point. We'll have a knowledge of the economic benefits that are flowing to load, and then we have generators that are receiving a benefit that should be willing to chip in a substantial portion of those projects as well. And so hopefully in that way you can achieve an outcome that's more optimal for everyone, that everybody gets projects built that they need, but there is better sharing of costs. We aren't planning them just as projects to serve load and load pays for the whole thing. We aren't planning them just as projects to serve interconnect generators and they pay the whole thing. You're finding projects that meet multiple needs and then asking multiple folks to pay some. The only quibble I would have is that we're planning a bunch of projects along the seam and we didn't optimize them for resilience. Now that maybe wasn't known as a big need at the time, but I think in the future, as we're planning these projects, let's throw that in the mix as well. Let's try to improve import-export capability with these projects. But I don't view this necessarily as a model of how everybody needs to do this in the future. I view this JTIQ process as almost more proof of concept. You can plan to more optimally meet multiple needs and share the costs. And I hope it starts taking us down that path, because that's the direction I think we need to go.
Sorry, I was so looking over there. I didn't see which of you put your cards up first, but let me get Commissioner Phillips, and then we'll go to you, Commissioner Christie.
I'll be quick, Commissioner Christie. I just want to note as a general matter, I want to agree with Chairman French as well as Chairman Glick and others that a less siloed approach probably makes sense. Also think that some expanded set of benefits makes sense as well. And as you talk about expanded benefits, one of the things I want to just put on the table is that I want to join the chorus of people applauding NARUC's comments, in particular, the comment that they made about exploring mechanisms to explore how benefits flow to underserved and disadvantaged communities. I'm also interested in making sure that sufficient benefits do go to those communities. So that's less of a question, more of a comment. I just want to put it on the record. Thank you.
So as we keep going, I just want to, I guess, name something, which is that I think we're hearing a lot of folks saying, have these categories. We want to look at more benefits. We want to look at those benefits, maybe regardless of which category they're in, if they're appropriate. But I want to just crystallize as you keep going. I'm hearing some people say that it should be less siloed or not siloed, and others saying we should be more flexible, but still have those three categories. So just as we keep going, let's just kind of keep that in mind, because I don't think everybody's saying the same thing exactly here. Commissioner Christie.
Well, I'd like to talk about a very specific proposal, move from the general to the specific, and it follows up on Commissioner French, and that is, I think there's a type of project that would be interregional that I think hopefully everybody could support, and I'd love to hear feedback from all the state regulators, but it's not my idea, but it comes from a technical conference we had, and we had Dr. Patton, Dave Patton, who's the market monitor for a lot of the RTOs, and basically what he proposed was that FERC should direct the RTOs to engage, to create an interregional plan with each neighboring RTO with the other RTO, or for a minimal transfer capacity between RTOs. Now, this would be a reliability-driven project, which is the traction of it. And it would be a way to increase the interregional flows, which obviously serves the reliability need. There's reference to Winter Storm Uri and how important it was for PJM's power. It flowed into MISO, which flowed into SPP, kept the lights on. So that is a specific type of project that I would like to, I think it's a great idea. I think it's something we could do. And I'd like to hear from the state commissioners. And again, it's not my idea, it's Dr. Patton's. And it would be each RTO would enter into a agreement with its neighboring RTO to build lines necessary to have a what they consider, and of course the devil's in the details, but a minimal level of power capacity transfer capacity between RTOs. I mean, it seems to me like that would be now cost allocation, as Commissioner Stanek said, everybody wants to go to heaven, nobody wants to die. But the more compelling a purpose of a project is, the more willing state regulators are to assign the cost to their customers. So I'd love to hear from state regulators about that very specific type of project, interregional, to ensure a minimal level of power transfer capacity.
Chair Thomas.
Thank you, Dr. Rob. First, I'd like to respond to something Commissioner French said with respect to JTIQ. That, in my view, was partially caused by a SEAMS process that the state regulators engaged in that wouldn't have been successful without very strong support from FERC, that Commissioner LaFleur attended our meetings, then Commissioner Glick, now Chairman Glick, attended our meetings. At one point, 35 FERC staffers filed into our meeting and filled the room. And so we were able basically to say, work with us to get this done, or you're going to, work with them to get it done in a more coercive environment. So that happened because of the SEAMS process, and I wanted to express appreciation for FERC in helping make that happen. With respect to Commissioner Christie's proposal, I like that idea. I think you should first measure what we have now to come up with a reasonable threshold. But the primary benefit of doing something like that would be to get started. Then you have data from things going back and forth. There were times in our SEAMS process where there were no transactions. It's hard to project anything when there's no transactions and you don't know what the barrier to the transactions are. So getting started will give you data to have a rigorous process to determine benefits and cost allocation. So I like that proposal. Thank you.
Commissioner Allen and then Commissioner French.
I just thought I'd respond to Commissioner Christie's proposal. I think my kind of quick answer is, maybe. From my standpoint, it's clear to me that we need to do more and better on the interregional frame, and there's just tremendous room for opportunity. And I'm not sure, kind of on a planning frame, whether that is best accomplished, better planning is best accomplished kind of through interregional planning and coordination. We've sort of had that through FERC Order 1000. We didn't establish minimums, but I feel like the framework has sort of been there. It just hasn't took off. I feel like, some top down and some integration of bottom up that is more interregional planning engagement with, I think some encouragement or direction from FERC is probably appropriate. The concept of a minimum makes me a little bit nervous, but I think there's just tremendous opportunity in that space.
Commissioner French.
I'll be brief and just quickly add my wholehearted support to that proposal. If you read the Kansas Corporation Commission's comments in response to the recent ANOPR, I believe we actually also made that specific proposal to create a minimum level of interconnectivity between the regions. And I want to say that's based on experience. As Commissioner Clements mentioned, we experienced Winter Storm Uri. We empirically knew what that did for us during that event. I think we had 7,000 megawatts of imports coming in from PJM and MISO that we were able to flow into our region. And that literally kept the lights on for most of that time. It was only during a time where you had some congestion and that got shut off. That was when we had a couple brief controlled outages. But we know that improving our connectivity with our neighbors will make us more resilient because we've seen it now in the past. And I think Kansas is sensitive about this because we know building interregional transmission and letting our low-cost resources flow out is primarily an economic benefit to other regions. But we also want to be flexible on cost allocation because we know that is a real benefit that we can call on when we need help. And there is absolutely an appetite that if there were projects to improve resilience, that I think Kansans would support paying their fair share of that reliability and resiliency benefit.
Thank you. So we're going to keep moving again because of a lot of subtopics that we want to cover, and we're going to move into kind of the second part of our morning, which is to drill down a little bit deeper into the benefits themselves, kind of, at least for the time being, move away from the categories and the buckets, if you will. So the first question here is, are there any specific benefits that are being considered by transmission providers today that should be more widely adopted by other transmission providers, and are certain benefits that are very unique to regions? So are there some best practices that we should think about using nationally in terms of of specific benefits? And are there some things that would always just remain regional and keep within that flexibility? So Chair Thomas, I think you were going to start us off on that.
Thank you, Dr. Robb. This question involves a comparison, and while I'm sufficiently steeped in MISO and SPP to fake it, with some of the ones I'm comparing it to, there's some degree of risk. So when one comes to benefits, we heard a presentation I believe is in the record of the FERC ANOPR from Johannes Pfeifenberger of Brattle that I think kills this category. He has it divided into lots of different sections, lots of different benefits, and provides rigorous metrics for measuring those benefits. And I think that's a great start for a discussion on benefits. And looking at that, I don't see big divisions in terms of this benefit and that benefit that aren't driven by environmental and policy differences between the states. But to make this process work, one of the things I think we need is common ground between those who see a policy imperative in building new transmission and those who are worried about a fair deal and fuzzy benefits on the other side. And how you bridge that gap, I think, starts with identifying with these benefits. And to my friends who support transmission vigorously, I would say it would be better to move away from assumption of benefits and postage stamps to a rigorous review of the benefits as proposed by Brattle. And I think you get enhanced data from new technologies, the grid enhancing technologies that FERC has been promoting can add data, bring rigor to that process. And to my friends who are worried about fuzzy benefits, if you can, throw a fastball by Johannes, I'll salute you on fuzzy benefits. I don't know that all of this is perfect, but I know it's characterized by rigor. Rigor in the opposite direction is what it would be to refute this. And I know we want to move from the categories, but I think when you look at the regions, I think the categories in some way form the discussion, and there's bigger differences you can find there than in the portfolio benefits. For example, in ISO New England, they don't have what they characterize or what others would characterize as economic projects. That does not mean you're not thinking about cost savings as a transmission driver investment. They just don't have the category like we have in other places. And because when you do your benefits, the next thing you do is you categorize them, and that flows to cost allocation. That's an important regional distinction. Similarly, the amount of the balance between the local planning entity and the regional is also an important thing. In PJM, they seem to be tilted more towards the local planning, which is why they have fewer cost allocation fights. In MISO and SPP, we're tilted more towards the regional and enjoy cost allocation fights as a result of that. In terms of unique, I see one bad unique. There's a settlement between MISO and SPP that we have identified as a benefit. If the transmission project can reduce the settlement payment, that should be a benefit. However, I do not recommend inter-RTO litigation as a way to get to that benefit. A second unique thing, and I need to study this one more, is in PJM, there's an economic project that appears to have a formula-based allocation that changes. Now, in the previous meeting, I expressed some degree of concern. If it changes, you don't have the certainty to get the investment. But with this particular project type, they seem to have flexibility so the allocation flows as the benefit flows without having sacrificed certainty. That's all I got. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Nelson.
Yeah, and I would echo a lot of what Chair Thomas said. That presentation was very rigorous and thorough. And one of the things that struck me in it was that a lot of regions have different names for the same things, and the categories of benefits that different regions use are similar but not exact, right? The commonalities are a little bit different. And that's one thing I think the federal government, FERC, could really take advantage of. If we are talking about looking at reliability interregionally, if we are talking about making the grid more interconnected, having a commonality of our terminology for benefits and what benefits are considered in what categories, I think would bring a lot of value to just the process and make people, transmission developers and the like, be on the same page and have people have a more transparent understanding. Like Ted said, you look at other regions, and one of the most enjoyable parts of being on this committee is learning about the rest of the country and how everything fits together, and the differences and the nuances. And I think there's a real value in the federal agency being able to find the common ground there. And that's not saying to take the least common denominator. That is not what I'm advocating for. I think broad-based benefits are key. I also think that once you've established those categories, looking at it in a two-part step of determining the benefits of a project, and then looking at the cost in comparison, versus trying to have the argument of determining the benefits and determining the cost simultaneously. Because as soon as you start going to the cost portion, it really turns into a different sort of argument. And I think making sure that you're establishing the benefits and making sure the project will bring benefits to the people in the region, that's the critical first step. And that can be done independent of jumping into the cost. And then the cost question is whether or not it's worth the price, right? Are you getting the bang for the buck? Are the right people getting the bang for the buck? And that's an important conversation as well. The last piece I want to touch on, which I think is a really important piece, because I think the biggest difference, and we feel that a lot in the ISO New England region, is the environmental policies, right? And so I think that's one of the things that I hope FERC in their NOPR does address, or at least go at, is the fact that certain regions value environmental policies. They value carbon. There's not a federal carbon price, right? So it's not something that is currently an economic, it wouldn't go in the economic category. So I do think it's important that most of that's coming out of the public policy category, something to think about in the fact that a lot of these things are blending. But the state policies for the states that care about that sort of thing, going back to one of Jason's analogies, if you think about dividing up dinner, there's some people that maybe have a more expensive meal or have a beverage with their dinner, and that might be a different category of people who don't. And I think that understanding that and acknowledging that will be better in the long run for people understanding the differences and the discussion of cost allocation about who pays and who's willing to pay. And I think that that's going to be important, because I think that's one of the big reasons why we're going to see a lot of push for additional transmission development is state public policy, is state environmental laws. And I think that has to be acknowledged when we go through and look at the long-term benefits of what the transmission is bringing, and then when it leads into cost allocation, which we'll talk about a little bit later.
So I think we want to provide an opportunity for one or more FERC commissioners to offer their thoughts and even reflect on, I think, what Chairman Nelson maybe just proposed. Would it be helpful to standardize some of the terminology, at least, that's being used across the country to better illuminate the benefit categories with the benefit types within each category of transmission? And what are we going to do about giving more guidance on, particularly on state public policy, environmental policy, where it could be different across states and probably will continue to be different across states? And across states within even specific regions. So anybody want to offer some thoughts from FERC, and then we'll just open it up.
I guess I'll start. I might ask my colleagues to join in. A couple things. First of all, to Chair Nelson's point, I think it makes a lot of sense to provide some more commonality. Obviously, regions might view benefits differently, and I know the NARA comments, which I agree with Commissioner Christie. They do. I thought they read well the first time, but they read well the second time as well. But I would say that the NARA comments focused on the need for diversity of regions and so on, and we want to respect that as well. But I do think there's some benefit to providing a more common set of definitions of benefits, although again, we want to leave some flexibility as well. I would also say it would make some sense just to elaborate further on benefits. And again, the Brattle report that was mentioned is exactly right. There are a whole ton of benefits that sometimes we put in these 3 or 4 different categories, but it probably makes some sense to elaborate on them a little bit. That's just my personal view. And as we go forward and what if we do put together rulemaking on this in this effort. With regard to Dr. Rubb, you mentioned the public policy issue, and obviously Chair Nelson did as well. That obviously is a very difficult, one of the elephants in the room, so to speak, right? Because you have some regions that have public policy goals that aren't necessarily consistent with other states in that same region. Now that's not, in New England, it's a little more aligned. That's just PJM is probably a good example where I think there's some states who are kind of all over the map on this issue. And certainly along the lines of you want to allocate costs roughly commensurate with benefits, to the extent that there are states that benefit from achieving public policy goals, those states should bear some of the costs. But I also want to make the case that it isn't just the public policy goals that are achieved when these projects are built in part to satisfy those public policy goals. There are other benefits, again, resilience, reliability, economics, and so on, that other people benefit as well. So if we were just to say only the states that have this particular public policy on carbon should have to pay for that transmission line, you'll be leaving a whole bunch of other benefits on the table, and I think violating what the courts have told us in the roughly commensurate standard. Just want to make one other point, and because you were asking, Dr. Robb, in terms of this category about other definitions or types of benefits. One area, and we've already talked about it on several occasions, and Chair French can speak about it with personal experience, what happened during Winter Storm Uri. But the need, I think, to subject to diversity, the benefits of diversity are so great and so significant that I think they go beyond the 3 or 4 categories we've always been talking about in terms of transmission benefits. And I don't think they necessarily fall within the reliability category well. And so from my perspective, I would like to see, if there's an attempt to quantify the benefits, of course you want it to be quantifiable, but to really focus on the benefits that having diversity, having access to other regions' energy, but also other types of generation in your own region, whether it be weather related, whether it be supply shortages, whatever other things that pop up on occasion, to have access to different types of generation at different times really provides, I would suspect, enormous benefits. We just have to figure out a way to quantify that.
That's Chair Phillips and then Chair Clements.
Thank you. Drilling down a little bit more on like what specific benefits could be applied more broadly from the regions. One of the things I want to focus on a little bit is just reliability. And I think when you look at SPP, MISO, and New York ISO, one of the things that they consider on some level is avoided investment in reliability and replacement projects. I think that it might be a good idea to look at that more broadly. I think it's something that might be easy and simple to quantify, to the chairman's point.
Commissioner Clements.
Thanks. I share the perspective just shared by Chairman Glick and wanted to emphasize one point he made and say it in a different way in the form of a question. It is true that public policies have driven a lot of the need for new transmission, but increasingly it's only one of the drivers. So it's not just we're going to try and build some public policy lines and then justify the benefits. It's that you have lots of different things, including the other things the chairman mentioned, driving the need for that transmission and development. Some of it is specific type of customer demand. And I think as Chair French spoke to pretty eloquently in the February meeting, a lot of it is just for the lowest cost delivery of electricity to customers, but transmission is a component of that conversation. And so how do we, this is what I'm asking myself over and over as we're having these conversations and looking through the record, how do we allow for that to be the case? Appreciating that if you do break down those silos and you build the transmission to address those multiple needs, you can do it more cheaply than you can if you just take one and build that need, and then you just take another and build that need. So can we embrace the idea that some of this is being driven by a need, and that need should be paid for by the people who benefit from that need? But let's allow the other benefits to come in so that we're building out the system in a way that's cost effective, that protects customers, and that doesn't build more infrastructure than we need to build.
Chair Stanek.
Drawing what Commissioner Clements just stated, all the commissioners at this table have some type of CPCN authority, and it's probably the most difficult part of our job to site these transmission lines. And they only come one at a time typically. So to the extent what Chair Nelson mentioned a moment ago, if we have a portfolio approach, which is what Order 1000 effectively stated, look at these projects on a broader approach, it's easier to sell, it's easier to spread some of these costs to a wider base of beneficiaries. That might be the project, because if we start with a look at the cost first, a lot of these projects that may look good on paper may never actually see the light of day. We've seen so many of those projects just because the benefit ratio doesn't go above 1.0. And I think, as we heard Chair French say a minute ago, we know that 1.0 project would likely yield benefits in excess of perhaps the Order 1000 threshold of 1.25. That may be one political way for us to get some of these projects moving if we adopt that portfolio approach that Matt discussed.
Something triggered a lot of cards to go up, so let's we're going to go around Chair Scripps.
Thank you. I wanted to respond to the question that Commissioner Clements posed, because it's something that we've been working through in MISO through the development of the futures and ultimately into the long-range transmission planning process. I won't talk about that, but I will talk about the futures development, because I think it illustrates the difficulty of understanding sort of when public policy is being used as a driver and what that means. So some of the inputs that go into the three futures that MISO ultimately developed were what I would consider the easiest case of a state policy, a state RPS, enacted by the legislature, signed by the governor in statute, but also state goals, which are not necessarily, did I cut out? State goals, which are not necessarily enacted in legislation, but a number of governors have articulated them. The outcomes of state IRP processes, to Commissioner Christie's point, where the commission has looked at a utilities plan, gone through the adjudicative process, and ultimately rendered an approval in Michigan's case. I know in other states within MISO, the plans are filed, there is a process, but there is actually no state commission approval. And then things like utility goals and corporate commitments and the like. And where you draw the line in terms of what is state public policy in all of that, I think is a very difficult question. But using them as inputs in developing, we think this is what the future is going to look like, I think has been a useful process. And then I think the other piece that is important in this discussion is a lot of this feels like state public policy, in particular around decarbonization. Sorry, I have no idea how to fix this. But a lot of it is also driven by a lot of other factors. So the retirement of a significant amount of coal generation and nuclear generation is as much economics, I would argue, as it is state public policy around decarbonization. And how that gets replaced, particularly sort of when you look at the levelized cost of replacement options, is also as much economics as public policy. And so trying to understand what's driving this and then how to quantify and allocate, I think, is a very difficult issue. And ultimately, I think Where I've gotten comfortable is that what is necessary in this is that there is a transition taking place driven by a number of different factors, but the obligation of the RTO, and certainly my focus as a commissioner, is making sure that the system remains reliable both through and beyond the transition taking place. And again, that reliability piece, I think, is something that all of us, regardless of where we come from, share as an objective in all of this. And in some ways, it's when you start unpacking what's driving it, it gets really messy really fast.
So I'm going to let's go to Commissioner Allen, Commissioner Christie, and then Chair Nelson will end with you since you started, and we'll move on to the next issue.
Yeah, my point is quick. I just wanted to pivot from a point that Chairman Glick made about the importance of the diversity benefit. I know a lot of states are kind of looking local and looking inward as they kind of think in terms of the path forward toward greener and renewable resources. But I also believe that there's real value in essentially connecting, building greater connections within the region and between regions and to diverse resources using bulk transmission, and that diversity benefit is pretty important going forward.
I want to be real specific. Let's talk about PJM. So in PJM, multi-state RTO, 13 states and DC, the vast majority of projects that get into the regional plan are reliability driven. And they're regionally cost allocated. Commissioner Dutrail-Brown knows well, and I think you made the comment, we don't fight about it too much in PJM because most of them are local projects. But let's say, they get into the regional plan, and which triggers cost allocation. And everybody sort of accepts that. But to Commissioner Glick's point, so let's say that Virginia gets to tell PJM, we have an RPS, plan a line for us, okay, fine. Comes back $1 billion line, and it's meant to serve Virginia's RPS. Should consumers in Indiana pay for that? I mean, you can take any line that's ever been built and say there's a benefit. I mean, there is a incremental reliability benefit. There's less congestion nearby. The question, though, is it the optimal solution? And again, should someone in Indiana pay for a line that's primarily there to serve Virginia's RPS? So PJM came up with what's called the state agreement approach, and the NARUC comment basically says this is the model. I agree it's a model. If it's public policy driven, the states that want it for their public policy pay for it. And the incremental benefits, again, every line has incremental benefits. But if you're going to charge consumers for a $1 billion line, the benefits, it's going to be hard to find incremental benefits for someone in Indiana or Michigan for a line built to serve Virginia's RPS. And one of the problems, now you could decouple that. One of the problems we've got right now is that when lines go into the regional plan, even before a single state, Commissioner Stanek mentioned states have siting authority, they do. But the way we have it right now, before a line goes to a single state for CPCN to get built, under FERC's policies awarding CWIP, construction work in progress, the money starts to flow from consumers' pockets to the developer immediately. Immediately. So if you could decouple that, you could broaden the array of projects that go into a regional plan, because right now, and that's why in PJM, the state agreement approach is exactly the right model. If you could decouple the flow of money from consumers' pockets to developers as soon as a project goes into the regional plan, you might be able to decouple the cost allocation. Because then you could have a broader array of projects going into the regional plan if they weren't going to be regionally cost allocated immediately, and money wouldn't come out of consumers' pockets until they'd at least been vetted at the state level.
Thank you, and we're going to be returning to this after lunch because I think you're hitting a very big and complicated, probably question that a lot of people are going to want to opine on about what happens with a public policy benefit, a public policy driven project initially, but also has other reliability and economic benefits for the region. What should be done with that and if it's part of a portfolio. So I think we're going to want to return to that because that's a big question, obviously. But Chair Nelson, you had your card up.
Yeah, and I'll be quick because I know we have a lot to cover today. I just want to clarify and reiterate, since I think I started that line of questions. But I think Commissioner Clement hit on it exactly. I think that I haven't seen a transmission project being proposed or built that doesn't have a whole suite of benefits. It just, it's the benefit of it is blurred a lot more. And I think that the way that functions in a region has a cascading effect. If you're building a transmission project that's bringing a new resource into the market, that can cause other generators to make decisions about retirement or staying in the market, which could have a reliability impact. There's a whole suite of things that happens now under the changing environment that we're in. And my point was only that we shouldn't ignore that, and we should think about that, and we should think about the way to get to just and reasonable rates and fairness. And I hope that is a conversation we continue to have.
I'm going to just layer in one more question before the lunch break, and this has to do with about how we look at the certainty of benefits and avoid the fuzzy benefit issues. So how should the certainty of benefits be addressed? And for example, should benefits have to be quantifiable, and what tools are available or should be developed to kind of account for the fact that everything has some level of uncertainty, and the longer out we look, there's more uncertainty. So, kind of drilling down, which benefits are easy to consider and which are complex, either technically, politically, and what are the tools that we should use to do that? And I think we're going to if FERC had some thoughts, FERC commissioners had any thoughts about that, and then we had a couple of state commissioners that wanted to offer some thoughts. I want to jump into this. How should the certainty of benefits be addressed? Yeah. Commissioner Phillips, thank you.
I'll kick it off. It's usually a bad idea when you start talking when no one else wants to talk. I'll just say as a general matter, when you talk about quantifying benefits, I agree that it's a delicate balancing act that you have to take. There are certain benefits that are real, but they're difficult to quantify. You think about preparedness for extreme weather events. That's something that's very valuable, but almost impossible to determine what that value is. And so I think that the job that we have is looking at what ways can we quantify if possible. And I agree with the question. Do we need to put a specific amount or quantity on something like reliability in weather events? Just to get the conversation started.
Chair Glick, and then we'll.
I tend to think, I always use the adage, that when there's a will, there's a way, right? And in this case, I agree that it needs something, we need to have quantification in order to properly allocate cost. But I don't think and the courts have said this, we don't have to be, it's not an exact science, right? I mean, we talk about art and science and what's art and what's science, and we can talk about a whole variety of things that we all regulate where that comes into play. But I think there are methodologies to be used, whether they be discount rates, probabilistic assumptions, all sorts of different analyses that statisticians use all the time to really have a pretty good but rough but pretty good estimate of what those costs might be. And so they're difficult, but I don't think it's impossible to quantify most of the benefits that we're discussing today.
Well, moving on to the states, and you mentioned, Chairman Glick, that it's important to quantify even if it's not exact for purposes of allocation, but also probably for purposes of the original benefit cost analysis as well, just to throw that in there as we're going forward. Chairman Stanek?
I think this is one question where I might feel confident in saying that we'll have a great degree of a consensus here. I think as much as possible in terms of quantification, Commissioner Christie got it right when he stated that the comments that we filed in the ANOPR proceeding said we need to quantify as much as possible in order to have some cost allocation mechanism in place. And we've seen the list, RTO by RTO, of what they quantify. They all quantify transmission losses and production costs. SPP, though, doesn't quantify a reduced reserve margin. MISO doesn't quantify economic benefits. However, we know that a lot of these unquantifiable benefits have a price tag associated with them. And I think with increased forecasting capabilities, increased tools and modeling, we may be able to get there. I do see with the over $1 trillion of the IIJA funds, a lot of money will be spent on energy and infrastructure related programs, processes, studies. And it's my hope that some of these funding will be able to go to the national labs that will help provide us with the tools to effectively measure these benefits. I mean, we've made reference to the ICC case a number of times. And the second ICC case, the one after we got past roughly commensurate, made it clear that the MVP projects in MISO passed the test, but the postage stamp model in PJM fell short. So in terms of the court, it was somewhere in between to hit that sweet spot in terms of showing customers what benefits they'll receive for the cost. One other thing we heard a lot of today so far is resilience. If there's a fourth category, it may be resilience to add to the list. It's somewhat maybe coincidental that I think today might be the 1-year anniversary of when FERC closed the resilience docket. But when FERC did that, they made clear that resilience is of paramount importance, and perhaps the regions should address this issue on a region by region basis. And as one of the two MAC group representatives, we recognize that our RTO, PJM, is probably the most diverse in terms of public policies in the state, a lot different than the homogeneity of SPP, of MISO. Cost allocation in New England seems to be relatively stable. But this is one area where perhaps we recruit the resources of NERC and have them take a look on a region by region basis, whether or not we could have some certainty and more quantified markers in order to reward potential transmission projects with some quantifiable benefits there.
So we have Commissioner Rechtschaffen. You were going to add a bit to this, and again, also as we're going forward, maybe think about which are the benefit streams that we mentioned in the Brattle report. Had a whole page of them. Which are the ones we're most concerned about, as far as being able to challenging for us to quantify in ways that we feel comfortable, both in benefit cost analysis and in cost allocation. Commissioner?
Thank you. I agree with Chair Stanek that agreement is breaking out all over here. I think we all agree that benefits should in most instances be quantifiable. It's harder to pay for something that's very difficult to value. But as we've also discussed, we do have a good track record and proven practices. They are not fuzzy, as Commissioner Thomas said. I also think it's very important that we do include the benefits like diversity, like resilience, where quantification is still evolving. I would say those are challenging. Reliability is relatively easy to identify. We know NERC criteria and others. Environmental benefits, emissions reductions, local environmental benefits, local policies, I think are more challenging for cost sharing, and I would argue are the ones that perhaps FERC should give stronger recognition to, even if they are harder to precisely quantify, so that it's easier to accept in the cost allocation process. I would also note that in our comments, that NARUC said that we support increasing the use of probabilistic and other analytic approaches where feasible to account for the uncertainty in the quantification of benefits. And these approaches are, I would argue, better able to support multiple risks and planning objectives, and particularly for planning over the longer term horizon with the added complexity and uncertainty. Commissioner Christie expressed his concern about how effectively RTOs can plan for the longer term risks. And I think these processes, these probabilistic scenario-based processes, give us some tools that we can effectively use to plan for the longer term. To the extent we don't have a full set of data we need now, the commission could suggest or give guidance or require planners to phase in the use of probabilistic analysis so that over time we include this information when we have a more robust historical data set. One last point while I have the floor, I do want to confirm something that Chair Glick said earlier about the California ISO process and how it approaches siloing or its process. I'm not suggesting this is the model for everybody, but it does have an iterative process. So projects come along in the three traditional categories, but CAISO does revisit projects identified in an earlier stage if an alternative project later on can meet the need and provide additional benefits not considered in the prior stage. So that's one way of trying to deal with the de-siloing issue.
Great. Commissioner Allen?
Yeah, I just wanted to reference the NARUC comments. NARUC's comment said sound planning process should ensure that all realistic benefits are identified and quantified where possible. I take that to mean that, yeah, we should be striving for, and I agree with that statement, we should be striving to quantify any kind of relevant and realistic benefit, but I wouldn't push aside benefit categories that aren't easy to quantify. In fact, I think I would double down and try to find sensible ways to quantify those benefits. The categories that come to mind are that are difficult to quantify are environment, diversity, resilience, health and safety. But as Dr. Pfeffenberger had indicated, even categories like reliability that seem difficult to quantify, there are sensible ways to kind of quantify those categories. He pointed to the lowest cost solution as to reliability as an appropriate proxy for value when you're looking at an attempt to quantify value. That's that makes perfect sense to me, and I think that we have to just get better over time, but not take categories or benefits off the table because they're difficult to quantify.
Chair Scripps.
Thanks. Something that Commissioner Phillips said triggered, I guess, a line of thinking in trying to respond to Commissioner Christie's earlier question around something around developing interregional plans with between RTOs to meet minimum levels of transfer capacity. And it's, Commissioner, your point on preparedness for emergency or extreme weather events and the sort of broader resilience issues, I think that they are very difficult to quantify. And to Commissioner Allen's point, that reliability, even within some of the RTOs, is sort of a given. In MISO, baseline reliability projects don't even need to meet a cost-benefit ratio. They're just needed, and so we do them. And that, I think, is I think a real challenge, Commissioner, in terms of how to actually get this done. But it's also, I think, all the more important because it's difficult. If the main driver here is reliability and resilience, how to quantify that in a way that then allows for cost allocation between regions, I think is, the billion-dollar or multi-billion-dollar question. And I think, Chair Stanek, your idea of engaging NERC on this, because it's easy in terms of near-term 5-year NERC violations, but if you're looking at something broader than that, I don't know that we have the tools in the toolbox today to do that. And because it's interregional, it's something that only FERC can do. It's not going to happen without FERC sort of pushing us in this direction. But I think the benefit of doing that, of coming up with some sort of quantifiable reliability beyond sort of near-term NERC violation that's tied to transfer capacity preparedness for extreme weather events is going to be hugely useful both between regions and then within RTOs that are often, in many cases, struggling with some of these same questions. And a whole litany of other things comes up that if these are designed for sort of the worst days every 10 years, it's not only possible, but I think incredibly likely that most of the time the system will actually work in other ways, but that doesn't, and provide economic benefits in terms of congestion and flows between regions, all of which may be easier to quantify, but ultimately aren't the driver of the project. So how do you balance something that is providing benefits, economic and otherwise, but ultimately why they're needed are to address the sort of system-wide resilience between regions. If FERC can lead on that, I think not only will it solve the problem of interregional work, it will also give the RTOs and others tools in the toolbox for some of these same things within the regions.
Commissioner Duffley.
I just wanted to touch on the portfolio versus the silos and talk about what California just reiterated about having the separate silos and adding on. I think PJM, that's the process as well. And it seems to make sense that reliability is the main driver, right, for build of transmission. So you look at reliability first, then the second prong, you look to see if there's a more economical way to meet those reliability and resiliency needs. And then you look separately to the state public policy projects. And I think we have to acknowledge as well that when you talk with transmission planners, a lot of times they say those public policy projects are a different transmission build than the projects for reliability or resiliency. So I was thankful to hear Chairman Glick acknowledge the regional differences. Portfolio projects may work for one region, but may not work for all regions, and we need to recognize those regional differences.
Thank you, and thank everybody for the sharing comments this morning. We're at the time that we were going to take for a lunch break. There's one sub-issue, a question that we did not get to yet, and we'll talk over lunch to staff about whether we'll start with that or save it for another meeting. But does everybody know where they're going? Yes? No. Does somebody want to tell? I think that all the state folks have a room and the FERC commissioners are on their own. No. So I don't know if either of you have that information, or Jennifer, if you want to jump up and let people know. For everybody else, we're going to break until 12:30. We'll start right at 12:30 because obviously we have a lot of territory to cover. Jennifer?
Yes, the NARUC task force members are meeting for lunch in Anacostia F, which is I believe at the back of this. You go out these back doors, you just keep going towards the end.
That's all I could think of. No, it worked. I put it in my pocket and it was better.
Well, welcome back, everybody. I hope that people had a good lunch break, and we decided there was another question on benefits, about benefits that could be non-FERC jurisdictional and how those would be handled, but we're going to roll those into a future conversation so that we can move on to cost allocation right now, which we're going to do. And we have a shorter afternoon than we had morning, so we'll be moving quickly. All the commissioners have before them the the 6 cost allocation principles that were in Order 1000 or should have in front of you. And we're going to, those are principles, as noted before, that NARUC in their comments expressed general support for keeping those principles. We want you to just keep those principles in mind as we have our conversation, and we're going to end by circling back to the principles and specifically asking whether there is a missing principle that should be added or any of the existing principles needed to be massaged somehow to be more effective. So we just want you to kind of keep that in mind, and that's the question that we'll come back to at the end of the meeting. But we're going to kick off the cost allocation conversation with a methodology question, and then we'll get into some of the thornier issues about cost allocation. But the first question is whether there are current cost allocation methodologies used by transmission providers allocating costs roughly commensurate with estimated benefits. And if not, how should this be improved? So are the cost allocation methodologies used currently, are they fulfilling that principle of roughly allocating costs commensurate with benefits? And if not, how do we need to improve that? We need to look at the portfolio. What other things we need to do? So we were going to, I think, start. Okay. So we're going to start with Chair Scripps on that.
Thank you. So some of this picks up, I think, where we left off at the morning session in terms of some of the challenges of providing or allocating, defining and allocating costs associated with reliability and resilience. And I think one of the ways that RTOs and ISOs have tried to address this is on places where there are projects or portfolios of projects that have multiple drivers, where reliability and other difficult to quantify and difficult to define metrics are included, is to essentially spread those costs in a postage stamp type manner, or as my friend from Arkansas calls it, peanut buttering, which always is a better way of thinking about it, even after lunch. And the benefit of doing that is obvious. It's simple. That it flows to load. It allows for, even as sort of load patterns shift, that it continues to be paid for by load. And there are some obvious benefits. But I think there are some important drawbacks too. And so as we start to think about how we begin to get our arms around some of these more difficult to quantify benefits, particularly as some of the drivers, I think, are shifting towards more reliability and resilience, reflecting the changes in the broader electric system. I want to sort of take a step back. There's no doubt that CREZ in Texas and the MVP portfolio of projects in MISO have been tremendously beneficial and shown their benefits. But it's also, in my mind, not sort of a surprise that they've happened once each respectively. And I think some of the difficulty that you see is that a postage stamp type of approach also requires the development of portfolios. And then to meet the roughly commensurate, you've got to show benefits then in every corner of these large footprints. For a peninsular state like Michigan, where we also are 20% of the freight in terms of load, you need to show a fair amount of benefit into a peninsular state. And I'm concerned that the approach of using a postage stamp methodology may actually inhibit the development of meritorious projects, because it's difficult to have them go forward on a single basis, because they almost by definition wouldn't benefit every part of the footprint, unless you sort of zoom out and take a sort of longer term view that this is what we're going to use, and then over time it will balance out. But my guess is that there would be some legal challenges to such an approach. So and I also think that sometimes, while it may still be that the benefit of the entire portfolio is net positive, the inclusion of specific projects in order to show benefits to different parts of the region may be more of a driver than what is a fully optimized suite of portfolio of projects across that region. And that I think leads to some concerns about whether sort of the right projects, the best projects, the most optimal projects are being included. So I think these are difficult to quantify. It's one of the reasons that these conversations happen in RTOs a lot, where you sort of try everything, nothing else works better, and so you default back to a postage stamp methodology. And again, the simplicity is one of the main characteristics, one of the main attractive pieces of it. But I do think it's worth, whether it's with the national labs or with NERC or whomever, to try and get a better, more granular approach to how to quantify and then ultimately how to allocate some of these difficult to define benefits.
Thank you. Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Before I get to the question, I did want to give a shout out to Commissioner Scripps for a panel that he put together and moderated 2 days ago. If you missed it, I highly recommend that you review it. It focused on how to squeeze every ounce of value out of our existing transmission system, and also had a sensical way to build new transmission using our current rights of way with DOT and the rails. I mean, rails might be a little bit more difficult than DOT, but I highly recommend watching that panel. But now to the question. As a reminder, my answer is going to be a little bit different because, again, I am representing the CROOK region, and as everyone knows, we have traditionally regulated, vertically regulated utility companies, and it's really a bottom-up transmission planning process. And we use the IRP process to inform transmission planning. And so with respect to the question, the answer is the current cost allocation methodology for the CROOK regions, or the main parts of the CROOK region, currently works. The IRP process examines the future needs. They're examining reliability, resiliency, economic projects, as well as state public policy goals, if that state has those public policy goals. So again, I know I have been, I've probably said it twice today, with any rulemaking that FERC is considering, please recognize the regional differences and regional diversity, because the systems were built up differently, and diversity is always a good thing. I mean, I hope no one here has an investment portfolio that you're all in on a speculative investment, because that could lead to ruin. And if we're all in on one methodology, we could have catastrophic results. Not to be dramatic, but going to best in class in the RTO type concept, NARUC and CROOK support what PJM is doing with the state agreement approach that allows for, when you have a non-homogeneous region of states, allows states with public policy goals, decarbonization goals, to move forward with their projects and bring others into the fold through agreement with other states. And it allows that appropriate cost allocation to where states that may not have those same goals will not have to pick up those costs. And then I'm speaking for North Carolina now. A subscription model, I think FERC should maybe look into a subscription model for projects that don't necessarily fall within the definition of state agreement approach. If you have transmission being driven by customer preferences, say, large industrial customers or large commercial customers can band together and look at a type of subscription model.
Thank you, Chair Thomas.
Thank you, sir. First, I would echo Kim's point about the panel. In fact, I was going to ask the question, is any of this stuff in the ANOVA record? And I didn't answer that. Maybe I should have, but it's good stuff in terms of optimizing first To answer the question, I think that it does. I think the answer to the question is it does. And if it doesn't, you have a remedy. That's obviously FERC litigation that it doesn't. But I think as I answer it does, we also have to recognize the limitations of our current method, which we talked about the MVPs. There's one project I believe that's not yet in service. And if they turned it on today, what you would have was a project that was cost allocated in 2010. We've had a little bit of change since then, and those cost allocations go forward. One thing I think should be examined, you have to have certainty to get it built. If all the parts are moving, you're not going to get the investment, or you're going to get the investment at a higher rate, and that's not good. But if there are ways to preserve certainty so you get the investment, but have mechanisms that adjust to make it fair as time goes on, I think that would be very valuable. And to your Scripps point, I agree that we want to optimize the projects. And in a perfect world with a perfect formula, we would do that. We also have to recognize there's the human element. And the human element is negotiations. And when you get a suboptimal project, it's probably in there because somebody negotiated. So we need to be rigorous and try to get the right formula. But we also have to recognize if we want to get something done, there's a human element, and you got to meet people where they're at.
Thank you. Before I go to Chair French, I just want to provide an opportunity for any of the FERC commissioners to weigh in on this question about from where you all sit. Do you feel that the current cost allocation methodologies are allocating costs roughly commensurate with estimated benefits? And if not, how should this be improved? Where should we be looking for improvement? Chairman Click.
By default, I'll just pitch in just a bit. So I think that I just want to pick up on Chair Thomas's last point about the human element, because I think that's a very important point. We obviously are, again, we're bound from a legal perspective to ensure that the costs are roughly commensurate with benefits. But it may be, the concerns I have about a project by project approach is that it's hard to do that. It's hard to, one, you have to figure out who's going to benefit, and in some cases, certain projects, there aren't going to be consumers that are going to benefit. On the other hand, there's going to be consumers that are going to benefit from other projects that are in the queue, so to speak. And so I think that's why going back to the portfolio approach, I think makes quite a bit of sense. Just because there are, again, each project has to be beneficial, as Commissioner Allen mentioned earlier, but at the same time, it provides kind of a, we're all in this together approach that you're going to benefit from this one, I'm going to benefit from that one. I think it provides a much more optimal way of figuring out a way to allocate cost. It doesn't mean it has to be the only approach, but I think, and we've seen some regions obviously adopt it in some cases and not others, but I think it certainly should be an option that should be on the table at all times. With regard to the state agreement approach, which was referenced as well, I do agree that to the extent that states can voluntarily, if they voluntarily agree, and we're, I guess we can't talk, there's a case pending before us, but there are examples where states can voluntarily agree to take all the costs themselves, or maybe a group of states can do that and build a project that they find valuable to meet their public policy goals, or whatever that might be. But to the extent that there isn't that type of, and that's voluntary, obviously. If there are, if states are going to say, well, why are my customers paying for all of it when there's benefits going to 5 other states? I think it's to rely on the state agreement approach as only is I think problematic. I think that would it would stunt a lot of transmission development in many ways, because again, I think there are cases in which you might build a project with the idea that you're going to help a state or a group of states achieve their public policy goals, but that might provide significant benefits to others as well. And there's always why am I going to sign off on it if the state next to me isn't paying their fair share? So that's why, again, going back to the human element issue, I think that's why I personally think the portfolio approach makes a lot of sense.
Any other FERC commissioners want to jump in before I return to the state cards? Chair French?
Thanks. I'll be as brief as possible. I mean, I think this is asking, about best-in-class allocation methodologies and what's important there. And, I know the Southwest Power Pool, and I do think their methodology, which is, it's postage stamp, it's broad. I mean, I think it is a really big success story. It's gotten a lot of projects built that have broad-based reliability and economic benefits to the whole region. And what's good about it is it's proactive. It provides a lot of certainty. It says, if you plan projects and they meet benefit tests, they do benefit our folks, here is how they will be funded. I don't know if that's going to continue to work for all projects in the future. We're moving into a time where more and more of our projects are being built for economic reasons. They may be built for environmental reasons. The silos are coming down. They're going to be built to meet multiple needs, including interconnecting generators. And so I think, as Chair Scripps said, there probably is going to have to be some more level of granularity to keep customer confidence in funding. One thing I want to throw out there, and I don't know that this is the answer, far from it, but something that doesn't get talked about is there's more than one way to allocate costs. I mean, you can allocate costs and just they flow to folks, or you can change how you bill. And that also has the effect of changing the ultimate allocation. And so, there may be ways of incorporating some billing on an energy basis to recognize benefits that flow, like environmental benefits or economic benefits that flow with the electrons that are used. There also could be ways, instead of asking generators to be direct assigned cost, you could ask them to pay an access charge and a service charge for their usage of the system. I'm not here endorsing those methods, but I think they are potential alternatives or different methods we could look at that may still provide some certainty. Folks will know the rules of the road once those rates are set. And they may have the ability to more granularly divide out costs and benefits just as the billing occurs, instead of just doing it on a simple load ratio share, which makes sense for reliability projects, absolutely. So I want to throw out that alternative.
Commissioner Allen, then Chair Nelson.
Thanks. Interestingly, I was going to make some of the same points that Andrew Chair French just made. I think it's important to recognize that I value, frankly, the simplicity of the mechanism that we have currently in New England. It is a load ratio share framework. It's 12 coincident peak framework. I think it works pretty well for us right now, but it's at this point in time, I don't think it will withstand the pressures of more value streams, more complexity, and a significant expansion of that system. I think the subscription model is interesting. I think adding other billing determinants that Commissioner French had mentioned, those are all, I think, important dimensions of the conversation, and it needs to be informed by essentially the portfolio of projects that we see coming down the line going forward. Thanks.
When I put my card up, I think Andrew and Riley just took a lot of what I was going to say too. But I will say, I think there's room to add to the conversation to talk about the relationship and complexities, because I think, FERC has a role and a job to establish a framework that is reasonable and just and reasonable for everything they're trying to accomplish on how these costs are going to be allocated. But I think the regions know that there's a lot of regional differences that can come out, and they're different by project, they're different by region. And so I think that the framework can exist with both state solutions and a FERC model, just as long as we understand the governance and the order at which different elements of those are enacted. So, you know, when do you default to a kind of the FERC cost allocation methodology that's established if it's a portfolio approach? Is there room for states to solve that in a different way, maybe through billing? That might make more sense for that region based on that specific project. So I think flexibility is critical to moving forward, but FERC also stating what they think the right methodology is can also be very helpful to at least frame those initial state solution conversations.
Anybody else want to opine on this before we again layer in some more complexity? Okay, so I'm gonna again, I'm gonna move on in the interest of time and we'll just keep building the conversation. These things are all intertwined. So the next question is, under what set of benefits, both existing and expanded, would states be amenable to bearing the cost of transmission not expected to deliver those estimated benefits to ratepayers? And that I'm going to just drill down a little bit on that with an example to just make this a little bit maybe more complicated. But if to go back to an example that we were talking about this morning that Commissioner Christie brought up, if we have a project that's at least that's initiated by a state or a group of states for more of a public policy, whatever that public policy is, but that project or is shown to have significant other economic, reliability, resilience benefits, under what circumstances are states willing to kind of share in the cost of that project? And maybe if the more stark way of asking that is, if that's shown to be the case, that you have a public policy and a project that was initiated at least for public policy, but it is showing to have substantial other economic, reliability, resilience benefits, and you don't allocate those costs more broadly, is that then consistent with allocating costs that are, you know, roughly commensurate with estimated benefits? So hopefully this would be a good roundtable for my roundtables conversation. So let's wade into that, because I think this is probably the most complicated and politically charged question, if you will. So how do we address this? And let's see. Yes. Chair LeVar.
Thank you. I really appreciate that the beginning of this question was framed in whether states are or not amenable to bearing these costs, especially when they're related to specific public policy objectives, because I think that's the right way to frame it. And so I hope I can give some thoughts as we start this discussion. As one of only 2 members of this task force who regulates utilities who were not part of RTOs or ISOs, sometimes my thoughts are not as granular on some of the transmission allocation issues, but this is a question that I think is important. And if you don't mind me taking a slight deviation on a personal note, a few years ago, I was cleaning out my basement and found a letter that I had received in 1985 from Chairman Glick's former employer, Senator Dale Bumpers, when he was responding to a letter I had written to him as a high school student in the 80s. And his response, I don't have my letter, but his response was strongly agreeing with my criticism of FERC's Grand Gulf decision. And while that was a generation resource, not a transmission resource, it was all about state amenability to paying for costs. So I've been waiting since 1985 to talk about that issue to FERC, and now I'm in the room with all the commissioners, so it's a dream come true for me.
What were you doing in 1985 that led you to criticize a FERC decision?
Well, it must have been for some kind of merit badge. I will confess that I remember the Grand Gulf decision being front page news as I was growing up in Arkansas. But I did have a father who was a political science professor, so I think he played some role in my letter also. That's about as much as I can remember, but I still have the response letter. But when we talk about state amenability, I think that issue was really put into a good focus by the Oregon Commission comments on the ANOPR. And while I will recommend to everybody Utah's brief and concise and direct comments, I also think the Oregon discussion of the light touch versus the heavy touch, it's a short discussion in the letter, but it really brings into focus this issue. And the primary difference they describe between a light touch or a heavy touch is either a flexible or safe harbor approach versus mandating specific circumstances when binding cost allocation must occur. And I think that is a good categorization of it. And it shouldn't be any surprise that I would personally advocate for the light touch. And the reason for that is that if there's any one point that I'm willing to repeat in this task force is that the stakeholders in the West need time and space and flexibility to continue the momentum that's happening right now in some areas like energy markets and resource adequacy that needs to be successful before we can start tackling the transmission issues for better regional coordination. That regional coordination is really key to using our existing transmission more efficiently and making future transmission decisions more efficiently. But Western stakeholders need time to work that out. I also really appreciate Commissioner Christie's comments about state integrated resource planning, because that's very important in the West, and any coordinated transmission planning in the West needs to build on the current existing IRP processes, not break or replace them. So it has to use those as a basis for that. Some stakeholders, and obviously we have a lot of discussion about quantifying benefits. To me, whether a benefit can be quantified is the second question. And the first question is whether it's relevant to the customers of a particular utility in a particular state. And one significant aspect of that question, or maybe the most predominant aspect, is cost causation. Cost causation has to remain paramount as we evaluate public policy benefits and how we allocate them. We have to be able to make honest evaluations of cost causation. It can't always be monetized with precision, just like benefits can't always be monetized with precision. But we have to be able to have honest evaluations of the ways state policies drive resource mix changes and corresponding transmission needs. We have to have honest conversations about states that don't have those same policies but are still experiencing similar resource changes and transmission needs. And then there has to be some relationship between the cost causation and benefits, and that's going to be different for every project and every specific circumstances. But stakeholders in the West have experience working through these issues, and we understand the gives and takes, and we have experience with the gives and takes that are necessary, and that's why I think Western stakeholders need flexibility and time to continue working through these issues. I can give a couple of examples of our history with that. One, we have one multi-state utility who's recently made a lot of investments in renewable energy and transmission projects. They operate in multiple states that have different public policy objectives. Some states that have some very strict state RPS standards have approved those projects. Some states that don't have strict RPS standards have approved those projects for different reasons. They're moving forward. The process is working across the states, even though there's different public policy objectives. One other example I want to give is from PURPA. Because we don't have a Western RTO, the Western utilities are subject to the must purchase obligation under PURPA that most of you regulate utilities that are exempt from that because of RTO membership. State commissions are responsible in those situations to assign avoided costs. And that's, a slippery concept. We try to get as close as we can. The talk about whether it's an art or a science, trying to find ratepayer indifference and avoided costs is complicated and difficult. We do our best as state commissions in the West. Sometimes FERC and the courts tell us it was good enough, sometimes not. But one example that I think is relevant to this discussion is who bears the costs for transmission upgrades that are necessary for a PURPA project when that PURPA project was not part of the preferred portfolio from the IRP. In this context, again, I think it's analogous. Some Western state commissions require their utility customers to pay for those costs. Some, including my commission, has not required its utility customers to pay for that. That's a difference in policy, but PURPA hasn't come to a halt in the West. PURPA still works with different states having different policy objectives on that particular cost allocation issue. And we can continue in the West to defend our individual state policies while respecting those of other states. And I think that's what's necessary. So the last thing I want to do is just read, I think there's a quote from the NARUC ANOPR comments that make this point also. And they say FERC should ensure that electricity customers are protected from broad, indirect, or generalized cost allocation methodologies or transmission costs driven by non-national public policy goals of other states or utilities. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair Stanek.
Thank you, Dr. Rabb. It's interesting you said that this might be a politically charged question, and I don't think it needs to be, although Thad just brought in purpose, so maybe there is a political angle here. My public policy project may ultimately be Indiana's reliability project. So perhaps the example may be provocative by Commissioner Christie having a $1 billion Virginia transmission line. What type of benefits will these our neighboring states, if any, realize? Now, the NARU comments did support beneficiary pays and support that one of the 6 principles. But the question then is, can this still hold true if a non-jurisdictional public policy project is a driver that would support some states' clean energy goals, so RPS goals, otherwise? Again, that gets back to quantification of these benefits. So then the next question is, how do we assure that the right projects are getting built? And in Commissioner Christie's case of Indiana, what if they come forward and say, well, we could build this transmission project, get the same level of benefits that this $1 billion Virginia transmission line would have? I think that's a great example, because we don't want a state to pay more than it would otherwise bear. In other words, I think there should be some type of mechanism to require Indiana to only pay that incremental cost of the benefits, to the extent that the other public policy state is number one, fulfilling their mandate, and number two, cost causation is prompting Virginia in this example to put the policy into the mix. That way, no particular state with one of these non-FERC jurisdictional public policy end up paying more than necessarily their fair share. But it requires FERC and the states to make clear at the outset what these rules for purposes of cost allocation will be. I think one fine example that we've seen, we've discussed what's going on in PJM a lot today and the diversity of the MACRUC states. In October, we saw PJM release a study with respect to examining the offshore wind goals and aspirations of states from North Carolina up through New Jersey. They looked at public policies, they looked at our RPSs, they recognize that there's some level of cost concerns, cost containments, and political controversies. But I think that is one good example of an RTO being somewhat proactive in recognizing that we're trying to navigate these really complex shoals with respect to cost allocation and trying to help facilitate the dialogue. Because as my colleague, Chair Brown Dutrell mentioned a few moments ago, we haven't taken full advantage of the multi-value drivers that we've seen in SPP, MISO, and CAISO, among others. So it may be a politically sort of challenging question, but I think there are some answers. And at the end of the day, we don't want Indiana paying for more than the benefits that they're going to receive.
Before I turn to Chair Thomas, I just want to ask if we could have a FERC commissioner or chair maybe jump into the fray of and share some of your at least initial thinking about this issue. Commissioner Clements.
Keep promoting Commissioner Phillips and I to be chairs, so we should check with Chairman Glick before we see if we want to join him. This is going to jump ahead a little bit in response to a future question, but I hear a lot of emphasis around existing Order 1000 cost allocation principles. We've got these 6 principles in place in Order 1000, the cornerstone of which is the beneficiary pays principle and the roughly commensurate principle, which different people have talked about. So that's the starting point, right? We're already there. And I struggle to imagine your example happening, that we're talking about kind of the premise of it going forward, if there's just one line that one state 5 states away is going to propose that has no benefits to that other state 5 states over, that's just for that one state, that it gets cost allocated in a way where the Indiana in your example has to pay. So I think there's a real opportunity to take that cornerstone of those principles that are in Order 1000 and build upon them, and to do some of the things that I hear you, to give you the combination of the consistency you're looking for, the framework that you're looking for, while providing for the flexibility to do the things that make sense in your regions, but may not make sense in other regions. So if we provide some sort of minimum framework that allows for consistency in the benefit, at least some set of benefits considered, methodologies that work. I hear people asking us to lean in on the things that are harder to quantify, to start that dialogue. Those are things we can do that rest within the protections of those Order 1000 and however we build upon them principles in a way that allows different regions to get to yes in different ways.
Any other FERC commissioner want to jump in before we go to Chairman Thomas? Okay, Chairman Thomas.
Thanks, sir. I think there's a timing element of this question. When does Indiana find out that they're going to have to pay is the key question. And I think we could all agree that if there is a circumstance under which Indiana should pay, that they have the right to be heard before they have to write a check. I think it simplifies the problem a whole lot, the timing element. To me, if you have that circumstance and then somebody shows up with something's already done and says, congratulations, you've got all these benefits, here's your bill, that's no go. But then you come back around to the human element. There are circumstances which the folks of Indiana might agree to pay because there's some other project, and it gets back to the portfolio approach. And I'm sure there's folks here that would say we shouldn't go beyond at all the state compact approach, which might be the right answer. I personally would be willing to study alternatives to that, as long as Indiana has the right to be heard before they have a legal obligation to pay.
And that's a perfect plan for the next question about how we better engage states and stakeholder the process. But let's, since Commissioner Christie started this before lunch, we're going to let you have the last word for now on this.
Well, I'm actually going to segue into exactly that, because I think it fits with what Commissioner Thomas just said about state role in cost allocation. And Jason, I got a note, man. Maryland was the only state to vote against the state agreement approach, and you're consistent. So, all right.
Well, Willie helped me out. I think DC was on board too at the time.
I'm on the federal level now.
Yeah. Right. So, still an outlier. But look, Mr. Thomas raised a very important point, and it really gets to your next question and also to NARUC comment. There's several instances in the NARUC comment talking about the need for state regulators to be much more involved in the RTO governance and planning. And since we're on cost allocation, I want to ask this of all the state regulators, because that's an excellent point. If you get to bill a year later, you wonder, where the heck did this come from? But what would you all think, consistent with your own comment, about state regulators having a consent role in RTO cost allocation?
Let's roll that into the discussion. I'm going to ask the broader question, and that's a specific one specific solution to the question.
Well, you've got a specific question on sub-regional cost allocation zones, which is a question. But I mean, the bigger question is state consent to cost allocation more generally.
Right. I mean, the broader question is there sufficient opportunity for stakeholders, including states, to collaborate in the development and approval of cost allocation methodologies to build consensus among and increase buy-in from stakeholders within the transmission planning region? Mm-hmm. And if not, how can this be improved? And you just suggested one potential solution.
I'm asking a more global question. should state regulators have a consent role in RTO cost allocation, methodology, approval, so you don't get the bill a year later, like Ted's talking about? Why shouldn't state regulators have a role to consent to RTO cost allocation methodologies?
So why don't we go ahead and roll that into, I think Chair French was going to comment, and you can roll that into your response.
Promise I'll hit it. And it won't be surprising because I'm going to talk about the Southwest Power Pool. This came up at the last meeting that probably the Southwest Power Pool offers the broadest or one of the broadest sets of rights to its state regulators and involving it in the cost allocation process, resource adequacy process, other items. But so let me start by saying, at least from my perspective, just as somebody involved in the Southwest Power Pool, yeah, we are absolutely given sufficient opportunity to be involved in determining cost allocation. We have primary authority for setting the basis of any regional cost allocation. But I would also point out that there are times where other cost allocation items come up. They may not fit under the tariff exactly as the state regulators write, but the region typically always will run those through our group and defer to the RSC's decision making. There was one just a couple months ago where actually the member committee of Southwest Power Pool did not approve a cost allocation change. The state regulators did approve it, and it was accepted by the board at SPP. And so I think that's a good example of right now. SPP does tend to defer to the state regulators on how we split up these costs. To the question of whether there should be a rigid, consent of the states for cost allocation, I mean, I would say that's tough. I mean, while I think it has worked well in SPP, we're a fairly homogeneous group, as others have pointed out, and we've been able to reach consensus on cost allocation. We're using the grid in different ways today than we used to. It's becoming even more divergent. It's my sense that it's possible that consensus is going to be harder and harder to reach. And so I would exercise caution in saying our region or any region should have to reach, to get the consent of every single state before agreeing on a cost allocation methodology. The one other point I wanted to make is I also think it's just going to be more and more difficult. It's going to be more and more important to have more stakeholder engagement in the future. As the silos come down and you're planning projects that meet multiple needs and benefit multiple types of folks, maybe generators, maybe load, maybe two different regions, there are probably going to have to be increased forums for these conversations about how we split costs. I know on the JTIQ process I talked about between SPNP and MISO, there are benefits flowing to load in both regions. There's benefits flowing to generators in both regions. There are going to have to be a lot of discussions and negotiations between lots of different counterparties to figure out what works. And ultimately, I hope we can come up with a framework that works one time, but it would be ideal to come up with a framework that you could put in place for multiple iterations of similar planning processes in the future.
Commissioner Duffley.
Thank you. Answering for the Seabrook region, it's a different answer. And so with respect to SERTEP, because it's a bottom-up IRP planning and cost allocation process, there are really no issues between the states at the present time. I think what Seabrook would state is that we would not want, I fully agree with Chair LeVar regarding his light touch comments. We would not want to see anything that dictated any type of transmission construction in the Seabrook region without state approval. Going to the RTO construct and this Indiana example, I think the concern is for states that they would have no control over their own destiny and their own costs. And we also need to think about equity issues and energy burden issues when you're looking at this problem, because there are many states that have a much higher energy burden than other states, and to ask them to take on a state public policy goal of another state when they're struggling to maintain the cost for the main driver, which is reliability, is a hard pill to swallow. So the consent role for cost allocation, I think, is something that should be looked at. And I also will state one more thing with respect to PJM. I know there are some commissioners that believe, and I heard it here today, as states being merely stakeholders. I think states have a higher level of duty and are really not merely stakeholders. But there are some that believe that, so that's a disagreement between the states.
Commissioner Nelson, Commissioner Stanek, and then Commissioner Allen. Chair Nelson. Did I say Commissioner? Okay.
It's fine. That's fine. So I think I'm going to address Commissioner Christie's point a little bit. I think that I agree with Commissioner Duffley that the states aren't just a stakeholder, right? I think that to a large degree, we've enabled the RTOs to exist, and we have a pact and agreement with them, and governance is a big deal in all those areas. So in terms of having a consent rule, I think we want to be very careful about what we're defining that to be. So if it was a pure reliability project, I would have some trepidation about allowing states to have a veto over that, given the role of the RTO. I think that if we're talking about other methodologies, so in New England, we do have the authority to we don't have 205 rights, but we do have the ability to suggest alternative cost allocation methodologies. And I think that states might be appropriate to have a seat at the table when we're doing project selection or we're looking at what the options are. And I think that could be a very useful role for states to have in conjunction with the entity, the RTO, or whoever it may be making that selection. So I think there's something there, but I would want to be very careful not to turn it into states are 100% responsible, because I think there's a lot of other elements that the RTO needs to consider and be the primary function for.
Chair Stanek.
Matt covered some of this ground, and maybe this is a response to Commissioner Christie's question, but can there be some type of a process where state input is considered early on? And depending on the RTO right now, we may or may not have a vote. The RSC and SPP is very effective. The ISAC in PJM is quite a bit different. But at the end of the day, as Ted just mentioned a few minutes ago, Indiana needs to make sure that there's no cheaper alternative that is not getting, that won't be built because we're going with some premium project. And in that case, I think all NARUC members agree that beneficiary pays kicks in. Indiana should not have to pay more than its fair share of benefits. But state input early and considered early, I think by human nature is essential. With the caveat, as Chair Nelson just mentioned, there are some projects where you wouldn't necessarily want one state to potentially block a reliability project. And that is probably above the authority and responsibility of the state commissions and rightfully in FERC's lap.
Commissioner Allen.
Thanks. Once again, I'll try to be efficient. I appreciate the question from Commissioner Christie. I think directionally, the state role should be strengthened in the process in at least our region. I wholeheartedly kind of embrace, my colleague from New England's comments, his concerns. I would extend it beyond reliability. I'm concerned about vetoes and unanimity, but I appreciate the emphasis that can be placed on the role of states within an RTO. Thank you.
Let me just, Commissioner Thomas, and then we've got our California colleague.
To me, if a state is using this as a shield, I would agree to an absolute consent. But if there were instances when the state was using the fact that they had absolute consent to get what might be improper benefits because they know it's going to be built anyway, and they can dump a little bit off on the other people because they're not going to consent. Of course, when you get into a question of 10, it's very difficult, but if you're using it as a sword to gain economic advantage, I would want there to be some nuance to an absolute consent. But if it's being used as a shield, I would want the consent to be absolute.
Commissioner Rechtschaffen?
Thank you. I'm in line with what many of my colleagues have said. I support the role that Chair French has talked about, a very strong role for a regional state committee that's an SPP, but I am concerned with an absolute veto in all cases. So early consultation by states, a significant role short of an absolute veto is something that I favor.
I should have said already, Commissioner Duffley is correct when she states our regional view. In my view, would probably be an outlier within the region. I should have stated that initially.
Okay, so we've heard, I think, a convergence that early consultation with any state that might be impacted directly or impacted is critical, and that obviously we have different models in terms of states being very involved in the cost allocation to maybe being a little bit less involved, and then kind of a range of opinions about just how far to push short of absolute consent or on the flip an absolute veto, and that could be problematic in its extreme, but somewhere on that spectrum would be more useful. And obviously having states greater involvement is something that we're seeing and are going to see more of, and figure out ways to do that productively. I think maybe a question back to the FERC commissioners before we leave this is there something that FERC could put out around state engagement and as a sort of a special stakeholder that having heard the conversation, that might be helpful in kind of at least having expectations out there, or another principle or something along those lines. Chairman Cluck.
So just to throw it out there, and again, this is only my idea. I don't want to, I'm not speaking for our colleagues, but I think that, and this, first of all, I think this has been a very helpful discussion for twofold. One, with regard to Commissioner Christie's point, I get his point. I think that I look at these things a lot of times from a legal perspective. If a state were to say no, would that satisfy the requirements we have under the ICC, the Illinois, the ICC cases that we talk about so often? Secondly, though, it's pretty clear that we need to provide, from my perspective, we need to provide a sufficient mechanism to ensure sufficient participation in the decision-making process for state commissions. And so just to throw something out is, I wonder whether there's some sort of requirement that as part of the regional planning process, that they come up with some sort of mechanism to provide for state participation, for states to be able to provide an alternative approach, kind of like you mentioned, Chair Nelson, like I think I don't know if it's a jump ball approach, but like New England has, but some sort of alternative approach to the ex-ante cost allocation approach that the region might have taken otherwise. Just to ensure, I think we could meet our legal requirements, but ensure that the states have sufficient role in terms of at least as I think was made the case really about Indiana, making sure Indiana or some other state would be able to have a say before the decision was made.
Whoops, Commissioner Clements.
Thank you. Another thing you could add on to that idea from Chairman Glick is if you've got a line that someone is interested in doing more with, right? You could, and you had agreement upon a cost allocation, but is there a way that a customer or a state or some grouping of them could suggest that we want to put in more money to do something more than what the line does from a cost benefit perspective? On the state mechanism question, this is one I think we could still use some more input on. What does it mean in practice to give states that early consultation role in the transmission planning process when you've got a regional planning process that doesn't get down to the specificity of where a line's going to go necessarily? But you have state perspectives on that. You also have on the other end the state responsibility for considering the siting, and therefore might have some limitations on the way they weigh in at the upfront. And so that's something we're trying to figure out what to do with. I think we want to provide some sort of, I'll speak for myself, I'm hoping to provide some sort of opportunity, and I don't know what it looks like mechanically. There's also transparency in the local planning process and how, who's looking at the projects that are getting done at the local level and how those feed into the regional planning process, and how states are ensuring that they have input or knowledge, awareness around the decisions being made there. So those are a couple more areas on the state transparency or the state participation front that I'm thinking about.
Yeah, Commissioner.
Thank you. I just wanted to pick up a little bit in terms of one of the statements that, well, in general, the conversation has been talking about more participation by states in the process. But I think also if you look at what we've been talking about all along, it's what the regions are looking at, what works best for them. I also get concerned in terms of when we're trying to broaden the conversation in terms of benefits. We don't have a clear understanding what the benefits are, but what we do know, and I think I stated this earlier, is that there have been some states or some regions. I think my example earlier was the New York ISO. When they're looking at benefits in terms of social benefits. And other areas may be looking at environmental benefits and things of that nature because it works for them. So I'm concerned in terms of the conversation that we need to have more clarity in terms of all of that, because I also am concerned, where is FERC's jurisdiction? I think that was one of the questions that we never got to. FERC's jurisdiction in terms of benefits and the state's jurisdiction. I use that constantly in terms of my legal background. I get concerned of how far FERC can go. I know you guys are probably concerned as well as how far you can go, but also looking at the state's opportunities or rights. We in Pennsylvania, and probably most of the other states here, have the siting authority. We're not specifically talking about that, but siting authority, which is important because it's important on the local level. We as the state regulators are the ones that are going to come to and complain and argue, why are you allowing this project to go through this area? So I just throw all of that out there, not because I have an answer for you, but more of we need to be cognizant of all of that, especially as we as state regulators. And I know you guys are concerned as well, but I throw that out there. Thank you.
Commissioner Christie.
Yeah, I want to follow up on something that Commissioner Clements just raised, which is a really important issue, and she raised the issue of the cost that's associated with these local projects. And NARUC mentions in the comment 2 or 3 times the concern that NARUC has for whether these local projects, and by local I mean they're not being regionally cost allocated, they're usually confined within the LSC, but nevertheless they cost a lot of money. We all know that's driving the bills. It's like 80% of transmission spend is going into, depending on the RTO or the non-RTO, but it is the vast majority of transmission spending are local projects, and you've mentioned your concern in the comment several places. So I'd like to ask all the state commissioners, one of the concerns expressed in your comment was these are not being vetted. There needs to be more transparency. And it must vary from state by state. I mean, there's some states where they have to get a CPC in, like Virginia, and they get thoroughly vetted, but there must be situations where they're not. So I'd love to hear from all the state commissioners, when you express your concern about local projects not being vetted or not being sufficiently reviewed, what is the genesis of that? I mean, and what solution, more importantly, what solution do you see? I think you talk about in the comment, we need more transparency, and that's good. But could y'all flesh that out? I mean, I'd really love to hear it. Is how do you see, from a state perspective, addressing this problem you've identified, which is local projects, which are driving the bulk of the costs to consumers, are not being thoroughly vetted or scrutinized? I'd love to hear from state commissioners on that.
So first, I'm going to just go to Chair LeVar to answer the question that was on the table. And then we're not going to have time to have every commissioner respond to you, but if we can get a couple, because we only have about 25 minutes before we have to close, and we have another big question. So go ahead.
I'll be brief, and this may be a bit of a tangent, but I think it also goes to what Commissioner Christie was just talking about and what Chairman Glick and Commissioner Clements. As someone from a state that's not part of an RTO, one of the things that I still am trying to come to grips with as I look at how RTOs operate, particularly how state committees operate, is when you talk about the concept of what right does a state have, veto versus input versus whatever. I still can't get completely comfortable with a state commission acting by one of its members voting on a committee versus the traditional way a commission acts by having a docket, taking stakeholder input, taking testimony, and coming to a decision. So maybe that's just time and experience, but I really have discomfort with the idea of a state commission's acquiescence to something or agreement to something or whatever, however that authority comes out, being one member of that commission voting on a committee. Again, that's a bit of a tangent. We're not going to solve that issue here today, but I just wanted to mention that because I think it's somewhat relevant to the issues that have been being discussed.
Good, so let's put a pin in that, because the how that it's done, if the desire is for states to be more involved, that's one thing, but how they do it in a way that's consistent with state law and state policy and what makes sense is a whole nother set of issues. So, okay, let's have two responses if we can to Commissioner Christie's, and then we're going to go to our last question. We've got about 15 minutes. Yeah. Chair French.
Yeah, just to the specific question of, what are the concerns around local planning projects? And this is not to say that our utilities are not transparent with us. I think they try to explain what they're doing there. But from my perspective, and it's because I'm that one person that sits on the the regional committee, and I see everything that's happening in the RTO planning process. Those bigger projects, the stuff that is the result of notice to construct from SPP, that stuff is far more transparent and delivered and explained to the states. Often the smaller local reliability projects, I don't believe they even flow from notice to construct from the RTOs, and so they often will end up in transmission ATRRs. But then even if they were within state rates, not in the formula rate, they're subject to the same cost allocation that you would expect of anything else a state does, which is a complete after the fact review, prudence review years down the line after they're put in service. So to me, and as well as I do how difficult it is to judge after the fact the prudence of something like a line, especially years down the road. And so I guess from my perspective, what we have with the RTOs and the level of insight that we're given into the planning, especially when there's any major project, and the vetting that goes along with that, the fact that it's paid for by multiple entities so that everybody's got incentive to vet those projects is I hate to admit it, but it's to me it's been far superior to what we do on the state side with a complete after the fact review. So that's what I have to add to that. But I do think there is also this issue of kind of a sweet spot of these very small local reliability projects that may make their way into formula rates, but don't get quite the vetting at the RTO or at the State Commission or at FERC, and they flow into a formula rate, and that is difficult to accept sometimes.
Chair Thomas.
I think that 80% number would be less than 5% in MISO or SPP. I think that's a PJM problem. We had one large other project that was pushed in our region because the state wanted it very badly and also wanted to pay for it. They said, we'll pay for it, we want it. It probably didn't meet the criteria. So they're going to build that anyway. It's because the state wanted it in that instance. Where the hole is, when you're vertically integrated, I think we cover it all. But when you have a FERC tariff, usually the FERC reviews the formula. I think there's a soft spot in terms of the cost data that flows through the formula in subsequent years. And then when the states ask about it, because it's a cost component, what they often hear is, that's FERC, you don't have jurisdiction over that, we're not going to show you those costs. And then the principal review at the FERC level is to establish the formula on the front end, and as the costs flow through the formula over time, there's a soft spot, those costs need to be reviewed.
So we have about 20 minutes left in the meeting, and as I mentioned at the beginning, we wanted to circle back to the principles, because in some ways the principles are, if not where the rubber hits the road, at least the kind of guiding lights. So after today's conversation, do people still feel the Order 1006 principles on cost allocation are solid, comprehensive, as people initially thought? Is there a need to further refine or expand the principles? Are there any principles that are getting in the way of development of transmission? And so we had a few, we're going to take a few comments from, I think we were going to first say if FERC wanted to jump in. Anybody on that from what you've heard today? Where you see there might be another principle needed or refinement to the existing principles, and then we've got some state commenters. And again, this is going to be an ongoing conversation among this task force. So it's just any initial thoughts of what you heard today that said, oh, we're missing something, or something needs to be further fleshed out or defined differently. Commissioner Clements?
Thanks. I'll just reiterate what I said before, which I had thought about in response to this question, which is the idea that at least the cornerstone of the principles seem, at least the cornerstone of the principles seem still relevant. They're legally tried and true. As we discussed before, there's some, it's not completely defined, but it's a starting point. Is there room for improvement? And within that, I'm certainly open to that. I think it's important that we already have a nice base upon which to build in terms of those principles.
Solid foundation, but they may be able to be refined and improved. Okay. Any other Commissioner want to jump in on that before we just hear from states? Commissioner Christie?
Just say I agree with NARUC. The FERC order cost allocation principles are sound.
Okay. We're going to start with Commissioner Allen. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll just say up front that I'm in the category of thinking that there actually is room for improvement, and I just wanted to identify the whys and some of the whats, and this is a departure from our NARUC comments, which I think were more supportive of the existing principles. And I'm not trying to broadside the principles. I think they are largely solid, as the FERC commissioners had kind of referenced. But as I think about it broadly, I harken back to my earlier comments about cost containment. I think the principles are more focused on what I think of as equity, the benefits received side of it, as Commissioner LeVar had mentioned, in the regulatory arena, we also are concerned about cost causation, and cost causation and benefits received aren't always, well aligned. And it's important to kind of recognize that there is sometimes divergence when you're talking about electricity and the movement of electricity and how the benefits can actually flow from, load as a driver or the placement of generation. So I would take a harder look at the first principle and consider how to infuse and recognize the added dimension of cost causation as a part of the broad concerns around equity. I think it also speaks to concerns that I have about cost containment, energy efficiency, and affordability, as Commissioner Phillips had referred to. The second principle that I would like to take a harder look at is the 6 principles. I think it's framed in terms of the more siloed approach to thinking about our planning approach and the allocation of cost, dimensioned by those different categories. As we've discussed today, I think as we think more towards integrating the planning and maybe de-siloing a bit in the planning process, we should also do that within the portfolio of projects or even individual projects, and recognize that there are often multiple categories of benefits, and you should probably recognize as you dimension the cost recovery frame accordingly to reflect the character of even reliability projects can have significant market efficiency improvements, and the billing determinants, as Chair French had mentioned earlier, might need to kind of, I'm attributing my comments to him, but on this issue, I appreciate his recognition that when you pool costs, you can apply different billing determinants, if you will, and to do that kind of efficiently and appropriately, you may need to recognize and create some elbow room through the billing determinants, or as Commissioner Duffler had mentioned, another framework for. I think of it as an open season, but a subscription frame for the cost allocation approach. The final thing I'd say here is, and this is probably because of my economic sensibilities, but it's recognizing that as we allocate costs, what we're doing, and hearkening back to our dinner table metaphors, what we're doing is not just addressing the issue of cost recovery. We're not just addressing the issue of fairness in the allocation, but we're also sending on a forward-looking basis price signals, implicit price signals. To apply the dinner table metaphor, if you establish a framework that exists going forward for cost recovery, some folks may not actually show up for dinner the next time, or they may go for the salad and skip the drink. It has effect on behavior that behavioral impact can either exacerbate concerns for cost containment, or it can complement concerns for cost containment. But it should, at least in my view, be factored into the FERC consideration, I think RTO consideration of the frameworks that they put forward.
Commissioner Allen, just on the last point, without teasing through everything else that you said, does that lead you to a missing principle, or
Oh yeah, I'm sorry, I should have gotten there. Yeah, I would add a last principle that really it's cost effectiveness, not so much in the selection of projects, but it's really cost effectiveness in the design of the cost recovery framework. So recognizing that billing determinants need to be designed carefully, and as we grow and dimension the value streams that are out there, we need to think essentially more carefully about the shape and design, and we can't necessarily rely on the frameworks that, I think have done pretty well to date. I just question whether they're going to be able to endure the challenges that we're seeing in front of us.
Thanks. I'll be brief. First, I know that there's been a lot of picking on Indiana today, and I just want to note with my Michigan hat on that I'm totally fine with that. Just wish it was Ohio.
Thank you for your comments.
More substantively, perhaps, and this, I think, bridges to the last question on involvement in states. There are processes in OMS, both formal and informal, for states to participate directly, and we've seen that both in the cost allocation and regional planning group, or CARP, that fed then into the development of the MVP cost allocation strategies. We're seeing it today with the cost allocation principles committee that OMS put together that has fed into the long-range transmission planning process, both in terms of planning the futures that I mentioned earlier, and then obviously and more directly in some ways on the cost allocation. And I think that's really important. So it is a piece where I think having a seat at the table, being in some ways sort of first among equals in some ways, and helping to drive the conversation. It's not the same thing as a veto, but it is a way of feeding the perspectives of the states directly into the process right from the beginning. And I mention it here because as part of that work, we developed a set of 8 principles to guide the development of the cost allocation frameworks for the long-range transmission planning, 5 of which were unanimous among the states, which is pretty remarkable when you look at the diversity of viewpoints within the footprint. And I just wanted to highlight them because I think they are in some ways, in many ways, very similar, but in some important ways have some differences between sort of the 6 principles in Order 1000. So first, the costs of new transmission projects should be allocated to cost causers and beneficiaries in a manner that is at a minimum roughly commensurate with and preferably proportional to the cost caused and benefits of those projects. Cost allocation should be as granular and accurate as possible, both. Benefit cost analysis should use metrics that are quantifiable, capable of replication, non-duplicative, and forward-looking. Costs should not be allocated to parties that receive negligible or negative benefits. Generators and load each can be considered cost causers, beneficiaries, or both, and should be allocated costs accordingly, similar to what Chair French has talked about a couple of times today. And finally, the cost allocation methodology for a project should be fixed at the time of project approval. And I think that gets to what Chair Thomas was talking about in terms of certainty. So obviously a significant amount of overlap between those and the Order 1000 principles, but also some important differences. And then finally, in terms of if there's anything missing or getting in the way, Order 1000 had a set of 6 principles for regional cost allocation, but also a set of 6 similar principles for interregional cost allocation. And going back to Commissioner Christie's question at the beginning and how to drive some sort of additional interregional planning, I think it's probably worth dusting off the interregional planning principles and looking at how that process works. And again, this isn't something that Michigan can do or even that a single RTO can do, but a bit more push from FERC in terms of interregional planning, at least on some sort of minimum level of transfer capacity, I think would go a long way in terms of jumpstarting those conversations.
Thank you. Chairman Nelson.
Thank you. So I won't take much. I think Dan did an excellent job highlighting some of additional principles, but I wanted to drill down on one. The concept of cost should not be allocated to a party that receives 0 or negative benefits, I think is actually a nice framework when we're looking at a broad-based benefit planning system. And I think to harken back to one of the opening comments from Commissioner Phillips, the equity and environmental justice issues, I think oftentimes aren't heard at this level as much as they are at the local siting level. And I think it's something that could be considered as part of or in addition to the existing cost allocation principles. So.
Great. So we're getting near the witching hour, but I would certainly give an opportunity now for anybody else who wants to add a thought on this question, specifically any specific suggestions. Yep. You're Thomas.
interregional planning wasn't within the scope of Order 1000 and therefore it didn't occur. I wouldn't want that to be left out of the table, but would also point out that interregional planning to me is RTO to RTO. But if you're in the West, it's different. If you're in other regions, it's different as a consideration. Again, this is probably, I'm more comfortable with this concept in my region. Although I agree with Commissioner Clements that these principles are a statement of the law, but perhaps supplemented by some thoughts on interregional planning. Thank you.
Anybody else? Yes. Chair French.
I'll be very brief. I wasn't going to say anything, but Ted pushed me into it. I don't want the interregional piece to be missed here. You know, I talked about how I think SPP's cost allocation method has been instrumental in getting transmission built because there's a mechanism set up, there's certainty for how we're going to fund it, and that has provided people the impetus to move forward, plan the transmission, and actually build it. We don't have that on the interregional side. There is no set up cost allocation method existing between regions. And I wonder if there was a requirement that they collaborate and set in place a mechanism, if the planning and construction will follow that.
We've got Commissioner Rechtschaffen from California.
I want to add my support for interregional planning. We haven't done it under the existing rubrics. As I think was just mentioned, we don't have other RTOs in the West apart from the California ISO, but we have other regional planning entities, and the interregional process has not worked at all. We just really haven't done it, and there's really a need for it going forward. Whatever form the future holds for the Western Interconnect, I think that's something where FERC should provide some additional guidance.
Commissioner.
So with respect to the Seabrook region, there are cost allocation methodologies, and they're within the OAT between regions, and they meet with the different regions. They meet, share data, and there's already that interregional planning going on. With respect to seams issues, where it's not a source and sink in one or the other region, I know with Virginia, Virginia is building offshore wind. As you know, North Carolina, Governor Cooper wants to build offshore wind. And so Virginia and North Carolina, we think it's a good idea. The two commissions have discussed, we should probably get together and talk about this and see what is least cost, what would be beneficial. And I go back to what Chair LeVar stated, is for FERC to have a light hand. The state PUCs are thinking of these issues. We're at the very beginning, and when there's a problem, we're going to reach out to our counterparts. So when you're looking at these interregional issues, maybe providing some frameworks, but no mandates. Thank you.
Great. So I want to thank everybody for your active and frank participation today. This will not be the last touch of this task force on these issues, so hopefully it's positioned all of you to continue to think deeply and creatively about the issues as you move forward as a task force. Normally, I'd ask for feedback on how the meeting went and suggestions, but we're going to have the staff reach out, NARUC staff and FERC staff reach out to you over the next week or so to do that in the interest of time. And so I'll just say at this point, I'm going to turn it over to our two co-chairs.
Thank you, Dr. Robb. I thought we had a fruitful, engaging discussion today. I was trying to take some notes as far as takeaways from my perspective in terms of consensus that we've drawn. And I had three overall arching themes, and hopefully I don't see any objection to these, but there may be. So the first was state consultation at a minimum, soliciting the state inputs. We obviously can't agree on some type of mechanism, but as long as the states are aware that potential cost allocation concerns may be brought to bear, I think every state would appreciate having some advance notice on that. Second, I heard from most of the people around the table the importance of resilience and perhaps making that a new fourth category for purposes of allocation. There's a lot of benefits that are hard to quantify, but perhaps resilience is one topic where we could have some at least base metrics on a regional basis. That's another theme I heard, as opposed to one size fits all in terms of resilience for the country. And a third and final takeaway that I heard was that unquantifiable benefits have value, but it's hard to assign those benefits if we can't quantify lacking methodologies or tools today. Hopefully, since we know that there are benefits and values associated with them, perhaps in the near future we could figure out ways to properly assign those benefits to those who will realize them. So thank you again to my state colleagues and for colleagues for their contributions today.
I too want to thank everybody for participating today. It was a very helpful discussion. I learned a lot. I think next time I go to a restaurant, I'm going to think about what I need to order if other people are going to help share the tab. But I very similar takeaways. I would say one other I would add, it's kind of an addition to what Chair Stanek said, is that I think we need to figure out a way to maybe expand the list of benefits that we're looking at in an effort to be more granular, both in terms of the type of benefits we're looking at, but also in terms of being able to better assess the value of those benefits and who and more importantly who benefits. So I think that's incumbent upon all of us to think about that on a going forward basis. I want to also thank Dr. Robb. I think he did an excellent job moderating. I think it was a really good discussion. And one other item, I really liked everybody's feedback. We don't have to do it today right now, but everybody's feedback about how we want to proceed. We're obviously going to have additional events, these public forums. I think just the issues I could think of, it's been mentioned already: cost oversight, generator interconnection, interregional planning, those types of things. I think we'd like to tackle on a more detailed basis as well. And I hope that we can do that. But I also want to get your feedback, and we'll talk with Chair Stanek as well, and give him your feedback as well in terms of what we want to do with all this, right? How we, it's great to have this discussion. I think it's very helpful, and what we do within the rules that we have at FERC and with the rules you all have at the state commissions about how we want to expand what we're doing here and think about more what we can come up with from a concrete perspective. So look forward to your input on that. And again, want to thank again staff for putting this all together, and look forward to the next discussion.